He lies on the quiet edge of a spiral arm, where the Milky Way hums like a deep cello in the night, and the air is warm and slow. She floats beside him in thought alone, eyes closed, breathing steady, as if the mind can recline in a larger room. Above them, stars appear to drift with unhurried intention, yet every glimmer is held by hands no eye can see. The universe invites sleep by telling a gentle truth. Most of what keeps the stars in their lanes does not shine. Most of what eases space apart does not touch the senses. Darkness is not an absence here. Darkness is a presence, soft as velvet, vast as an open ocean at dawn. Galaxies are lamps on a shoreline, but the shore itself is the hidden architecture. Around each galaxy, a halo wraps like a shawl. It cannot be touched, yet it steadies the swirl, letting the outer stars keep pace with the inner ones without flying free. He can picture that halo as a slow snowfall of invisible grains, each grain passing through stone, through skin, through the earth itself, with perfect discretion. She can picture it as a wind with no temperature and no scent, moving through everything without brushing a single leaf. The metaphors differ, the comfort is the same. There is something steadying the night. Beyond those halos, between galaxies that look like lanterns on a distant pier, space itself is stretching, not by will, not by force, but by a quiet pressure that feels like release. Imagine the fabric under a sleeping body, the way the mattress yields just enough to cradle weight without complaint. In the same way, the cosmic fabric yields, and the distances widen with a patience that cannot be hurried. This pressure is not a shove, it is not a shove at all. It is the calmest kind of persuasion, a smoothness in the equations, a low sigh in the deep. He listens to the word percentage and finds a curious peace. Only a small share of the cosmos shines in starlight. The rest is wrapped in shadow and serenity. The luminous part is like foam on a breaking wave, white and bright for a moment, while the water that carries it is much larger. She listens to the word halo and pictures circled light in a chapel, not luminous, but protective, a boundary that whispers, "Stay." The invisible does not ask for attention. It performs a quiet task and lets the show go on. There is a kindness in this arrangement. If every piece of matter were noisy with light, the night would be crowded and restless. If expansion were a violent rupture, nothing gentle could linger. Instead, the night leaves room for silence, and within that silence, life can rest. The galaxy that hosts him and the galaxy that hosts her drift through a sea of comfort. Between their worlds lies an ocean of space that grows without sound. The soundless is not careless. It is precise, it is measurable, it is felt most clearly by what it allows to remain. Delicate disks that keep their stars, clusters that keep their stories, little planets that keep their skies. He imagines the universe at large scales as lace, a web of filaments with glittering knots where clusters gather, and wide, quiet rooms where almost nothing stays. The lace hangs in 3 dimensions, but the mind can flatten it to understand. Where the threads cross, gravity sings in a lower register, and galaxies move toward the notes, as if obeying a conductor they do not see. The conductor never speaks. The baton is never raised. Yet the tempo holds, the melody forms, and the piece is played across billions of years. To listen is to relax into the assurance that order does not always need an explanation first. It can be noticed, traced, and trusted while the mind settles. She turns the idea of emptiness over, and it becomes soothing. A void is not a wound, it is an interlude, a deep breath between thoughts. In the largest gulfs, where few galaxies wander, space and time are most like a lullaby. Nothing jostles, nothing collides, and a gentle outward pull makes the distances tasteful and kind. Picture a soft tide withdrawing from the shore, not to abandon it, but to reveal the wet sand's delicate sheen. The tide will return. For now, it recedes, and the beach breathes. So too does the cosmic shoreline exhale, leaving room for all that follows. The numbers that describe this hush do not disturb it. They are driftwood on the sand, smoothed by the same water that placed them there. The idea that invisible mass outweighs the bright by several times is like finding more water below the foam. The idea that a smooth energy fills every corner of space like a faint perfume is like realizing the room has air even when no breeze is felt. These are not threats to the familiar. They are confirmations that the familiar rides upon a grander sea. He considers the smallness of a human life next to a cluster that spans millions of light years, and instead of feeling diminished, he feels magnified by context. Tiny things share properties with large ones. A beating heart finds rhythm in a rotating galaxy. A slow thought inherits calm from the patient growth of structure. She considers the tempo of a single breath and finds it mirrored in a story told over cosmic time. The inhale gathers matter with grace. The pause lets the pattern settle. The exhale allows distance to bloom. Darkness, in this setting, is a friend of sleep. It invites the eyelids to rest and the muscles to loosen. It holds the stars in their gentle orbits and sets the stage for a universe that does not rush. Even the most violent scenes, the birth of stars and the appetite of black holes, play out within a larger quiet that contains them without complaint. That quiet is the unseen majority. It is not an absence of care. It is the form that care takes when it acts without seeking applause. She hears a simple promise written into the structure of the night. Wherever light goes, the dark accompanies it, supporting, bearing, guiding. Where light ends, the dark does not fail. It remains patient as bedrock, soft as sleep. The galaxies are not falling apart, not because they shout louder than gravity, but because an invisible scaffold keeps watch. Space is not tearing itself to pieces, not because it fears emptiness, but because a gentle pressure makes room that is just large enough for the next step. He allows a final image to settle behind the eyes. A lantern hangs from a branch above a still lake. The lantern is a galaxy, the branch a filament, the lake the calm of stretching space. Ripples move across the surface, and the reflection slides outward. Nothing is torn, nothing is crushed. The lantern does not flicker. The world grows in a way that feels like accompaniment rather than force. In that image, there is a promise he can carry into sleep. The promise that the universe is not only a spectacle of fire, but also a cradle of quiet strength, built from the things that cannot be seen, yet felt in every steady turning of the stars. No arguments are required to keep this comfort. It is enough to rest in the presence of facts that do not clamor. Invisible mass steadies, invisible energy eases. The two together compose a score that lets galaxies, waltz, and distances breathe. The mind can entrust itself to that cadence. The body can loosen its grip on the day. The night will keep turning. The halos will keep holding. The fabric will keep widening with the softness of a sigh. The cosmos will keep the lights low while the world sleeps. He stands at the glass wall of an old observatory, the kind whose domes learned every winter star by heart, and watches a timeline assemble like constellations joined by memory. In that quiet, the origin of the mystery takes shape as a sequence of careful glances, each glance made with a different instrument, a different courage, a different patience. The first clue comes from a mountain in California in 1933, when Fritz Zwicky studies the Coma Cluster and feels the mathematics tilt under his feet. The galaxies in that cluster move too quickly. If only the luminous matter holds them, they should drift apart like ash in a breeze. Instead, the whole cluster stays together. He names the missing mass with a simple title, Dark Matter, and the phrase hangs in the air like a lantern with no visible flame. She imagines the winter light at Mount Wilson, calculations scribbled in the margins, and Zwicky holding to the numbers even as the idea seems impolite to the comfort of the times. The suggestion is not embraced. It lingers in journals and footnotes, a spoken truth that sounds like a rumor. Yet the observation waits, dignified, patient, because the sky obeys no preference. Decades later, in Washington and the high desert of Arizona, a pair of eyes return to the rotation of galaxies with a tool sharpened to the task. Vera Rubin, working with Kent Ford, points a spectrograph at spiral galaxies and listens to the Doppler shift sing the speed of stars at their rims. The curve that should fall with distance stays high and stubborn. The outer stars do not fade into slow drifters. They keep pace as if a great halo of unseen mass steadies their dance. He traces the arc of Vera Rubin's nights at Lowell Observatory, the way her data grew into a chorus that could not be ignored. Plot after plot, galaxy after galaxy, the rotation curves write the same signature. If light alone were the ledger, the edges would slow. They do not. the implication is precise and intimate. Around every spiral, and likely around every galaxy of any kind, there is more mass than meets the eye. A ring of gravity without glow. A calm correction to the thought that light is the whole story. The term halo becomes not a metaphor, but a map. While the rotation curves are sketching halos around galaxies, another path to the invisible is prepared by the bending of light. In 1919, a solar eclipse confirms the deflection Einstein predicted, and gravity becomes, in the hands of astronomers, a lens that can measure mass without asking whether it shines. By 1979, a double quasar is found, the light split by a foreground galaxy. With time, arcs and rings and subtle distortions appear in deep images, each one drawn by gravity's lens. He sees astronomers use those curves and smears to weigh what cannot be seen, and the weight is always too large for the luminous matter alone. Sky surveys begin to assemble maps of mass that are blind to brightness, and the maps paint halos and filaments in strokes of gravity rather than light. She turns the timeline toward a different kind of discovery, one that watches the universe itself as it grows older. In the late 20th century, two teams gather light from Type Ia supernovae, explosions that behave like standard candles. They use these events to measure distances across a deep span of time and to compare those distances with redshift, the stretching of light by expansion. The expectation is simple. Gravity should slow the expansion. The supernovae do not agree. The curves they draw on the sky whisper a different tale. The expansion is not slowing, it is accelerating, gently but unmistakably. The teams led by Saul Perlmutter on one side and Brian Schmidt with Adam Rees on the other publish results that rewrite the fate of everything. A smooth energy appears in the equations, a pressure that pushes outward, and the phrase dark energy joins the lexicon with the softness of a tide that was always there. He thinks of Einstein in 1917, adding a constant to his field equations to hold the universe steady, then setting it aside when expansion becomes the accepted view. The constant returns with a new character, not as a shoring wall against collapse, but as a property of space that encourages distance to grow. It is measured not through a single instrument, but through a suite of cosmological tools that agree more often than not. He watches as the cosmic microwave background becomes a picture painted by the early universe itself, a faint glow discovered by chance in 1965 and later resolved with exquisite care. The ripples in that glow tell of matter and energy in proportions that leave a small share to the visible. The rest must be darker, smoother, more elusive. She sees the still room where teams analyze data from satellites that took the sky's temperature with tender precision. The pattern of peaks in the microwave background, the shape of large-scale clustering, and the yield of baryon acoustic oscillations all speak a common language. The numbers they suggest condense into a simple summary. A few percent of the universe forms stars and planets. A larger portion behaves like matter that does not glow. An even larger portion acts like a pressure that keeps increasing separations. The elegance of the summary belies the strangeness it contains. Discovery, in this instance, is not a single shout but a choir of confirmations. He lets the scene shift back to earthbound tunnels and caverns where detectors sit under mountains, shielded from noise. In such depths, experiments hope to hear a rare tap from a particle of the unseen. The absence of a clear signal is its own kind of news, one that shapes what dark matter can be. Each null result trims possibilities, a sculptor removing what does not belong until a form might appear. These efforts do not name the discovery, but they belong to its unfolding, teaching the search where not to look and how to listen better. She moves the gaze to a pair of colliding clusters in a nearby universe, where hot gas slows and separates, while the lensing maps reveal mass, slipping through like rain through fog. The picture advances the case for matter that does not couple to light or gas in familiar ways. The inference is not casual. It is drawn from geometry, from the behavior of plasma, from the subtraction of what luminous physics can account for. The clusters behave as if two components travel together under gravity, while a third, the gas, lags and glows. The story deepens without spectacle, and the images become part of a quiet record that points in the same direction. He notes how the early questions used to be framed. Is it modification of gravity, or is it new matter? Is acceleration an artifact or a property of the vacuum? Over time, each line of challenge shapes better tests. The discovery phase becomes less about a single observation and more about a network of evidence that holds tension like a truss bridge. It is a kind of architecture where one impressive span would fail without the others, but together they carry weight with grace. She returns to the human dimension, to the rooms where astronomers wait for the night, where coffee cools next to notebooks, where code compiles and spectrographs hum. The discoveries arrive inside, lives paced by patience. Zwicky's abrupt clarity, Rubin's steady accumulation, the supernova team's painstaking calibrations, the microwave background's delicate ripples, all enter the ledger with dates and coordinates, with instrument names that become characters themselves. A simple truth rises from that ledger. When the sky resists easy stories, it does so consistently. The resistance invites humility and opens a path to careful wonder. He imagines a child visiting a museum where a full-scale spectrograph stands next to a photograph of a spiral galaxy. A plaque explains how color shifts reveal velocities. Another room displays images of lensed arcs, thin as handwriting on glass. A darkened theater projects the microwave background with its freckled pattern, while a narrator speaks of sound waves in a young plasma. The child does not hear controversy. The child hears a melody of methods, different instruments, same refrain. Something unseen steadies the galaxies. Something smooth encourages the expansion. She lingers on a small detail that glows like an ember. The figures who made these discoveries kept returning to the data, even when the data asked them to give up comfortable assumptions. The patience becomes part of the discovery. The willingness to trust careful measurement over convenience is a kind of kindness to the universe, a way of letting it be itself. That kindness is visible in the plots and maps, in the gentle corrections written in the margins of older ideas. He steps back from the glass, the observatory now a compass in memory. To name the who, the when, the where, and the how is to draw a constellation of minds and places. A mountain in California, domes in Arizona and Chile, mirrors on remote summits, satellites that cooled their eyes and looked back toward the first light, detectors beneath rock and ice, computers humming through the night. Each provided a strand that, braided together, made a rope sturdy enough to hold a new truth. The truth is not loud. It is a calm acceptance that the cosmos includes actors that hide from sight and yet leave prints everywhere they pass. She lets the last detail settle like snow. A discovery can be an instant, but this one is a season. It begins with a suspicion in a cluster. It gathers strength in the steady turns of spiral disks. It gains depth in the bending of light. It blossoms in supernovae that measure distance with a steady flame. It finds harmony in a background glow left from an early heat. It endures in the quiet of underground halls. In that season, the sky teaches a discipline that comforts the mind. There is enough in the evidence to sleep on. There is enough in the story to rest in. He studies a spiral of light the way one studies a seashell, tracing each arm as it sweeps outward into thinner glow. The mind expects a certain rhythm. Where light fades, gravity should loosen, and the outer stars should circle more slowly, like skaters easing at the edge of a rink. The measurements refuse that rhythm. Velocities remain high, far beyond the bright disk. A simple rule seems violated. Mass appears to be missing from the light, yet the pull is unbroken, steady as a heartbeat that will not slow for darkness. The surprise is not a flourish of drama. It is a quiet mismatch between what is seen and what is felt, written in kilometers per second, written in the flatness of rotation curves that do not sag. She follows the logic as if walking a shoreline. Gravity binds a system by the balance of motion and pull. In a galaxy, stars trace orbits that reveal the unseen sum of mass within. If only the luminous matter counts, the enclosed mass stops growing once the bright disk ends, and speeds should taper gracefully. Instead, the data write another sentence. The enclosed mass continues to rise, long after the starlight thins to a whisper. Nothing in the telescope's image accounts for that rise. The invisible takes on the duties of a scaffold that holds the outer lanes of the cosmic highway. He thinks about clusters of galaxies that behave like slow storms, each galaxy a cloud within a greater weather. The virial theorem gives a way to weigh the storm by the motions inside it. The numbers announce a gap between visible mass and required mass, a gap so wide that the term missing mass feels less like a metaphor and more like an inventory tag. If all the matter were luminous, clusters would unravel in a few crossings. They do not. The skies are far more patient than that. Something without glow provides the binding, so clusters remain families rather than strangers drifting apart. She considers what kinds of ordinary matter could hide from light. Cold gas could conceal itself, compact objects could lurk as faint embers, ancient remnants could drift as quiet stones in space. Observers have searched for these with microlensing and with surveys at many wavelengths. The count of such bodies never comes close to the gravity that needs explaining. A second constraint arrives from the early universe, where nucleosynthesis fixed how much ordinary matter could have condensed as hydrogen and helium. The abundance of light elements draws a line on a chart that ordinary matter cannot cross. The missing mass has to be of a different kind, not built from protons and neutrons in the familiar way. He watches a thought experiment unfold with the smoothness of a tide. Imagine flooding a galaxy with hot particles that race near the speed of light. Those particles would wash out small structures before they had time to gather, erasing the fine lace of dwarf galaxies and delicate filaments. The actual sky shows a rich hierarchy, small and large structures sharing the stage. That picture points toward matter that was slow enough to clump early, cool enough to seed the web. The language shifts to cold, dark matter, not as a final answer, but as a description of a temperament, slow to thermalize, faithful to gravity alone. She turns to the bending of light, an impartial judge that cares only for mass and geometry. In deep images, distant galaxies arc into tender curves around nearer masses. The curves reveal the total pull along the line of sight, adding up both luminous and invisible contributions. Map the pull, then compare it with the photograph, and a pattern repeats. The strongest regions of lensing correspond to more mass than the starlight suggests. The excess wraps galaxies like a cocoon, stretches along filaments that connect clusters, rests in halos that extend beyond the glow. Light has become a tracer, not a full account, and lensing writes the rest of the ledger. He pauses on a particular discomfort at the heart of the shock. Physics is a craft that builds intuition from experience with light and matter. To learn that most of the mass does not interact with light challenges that intuition at its root. Forces that shape daily life prove irrelevant to the larger balance, while gravity, the most patient of forces, takes center stage. The absence of electromagnetic chatter becomes a kind of silence that must be respected. Detectors attuned to sparks and flashes must learn to listen for whispers of momentum, for tiny nuclear recoils, for timing slips in rotating stars. She senses another reason the surprise endures. The missing mass does not wait at the edges only. It is present in the inner architecture of galaxies, in the faint gestures of satellite systems, in the sharper-than-expected bends of gas in spiral arms. Models that attempt to replace the unseen with a recalibration of gravity can succeed in certain arenas. Yet the full chorus of evidence asks for a component that travels with matter in 3 dimensions, that gathers into halos, that contributes to lensing and to the cosmic microwave background's pattern of peaks. Each piece presses gently toward a conclusion. The weight exists, though it refuses to glow. He thinks of the early universe, when the plasma cooled enough for light to travel free. The small ripples in temperature at that epoch encode the balance of matter and radiation, of ordinary particles and the invisible sea. The positions and heights of acoustic peaks in that ancient light outline a composition that leaves only a modest share to atoms. The rest must be darker. To some ears, this might sound like a violation. To his ear, it is a correction that saves the story. Without the extra mass, structures would not have formed as they did. Disks might have been fragile, clusters sparse, and the sky a more featureless place. She imagines a simulation running like a dream on a bank of computers. Gravity draws particles together, cooling flows form, and by the time the image matches the present day, the scene is familiar. Filaments bridge empty rooms, halos cradle galaxies that look like lanterns at crossroad nodes. Remove the invisible particles, and the dream weakens. The fine grain evaporates, the timing goes wrong, and the pattern loses its calm. The invisible component is not an adornment. It carries much of the load. He lingers on a single star orbiting at the outskirts of a disk, a relay runner in the far lane. Its speed is a sentence written by the mass within. If the sentence ends where the starlight ends, the speed must drop. It does not. He imagines a function plotted in quiet ink, a flat line continuing beyond the glow. There is a peace in such a line, the sort of peace that comes when a system has the support it needs. The shock then becomes a reversal. What seemed like a violation reveals itself as a sign that the galaxy is not alone. It is accompanied by a halo large enough to carry the race. She frames the mystery not as a puzzle that taunts, but as a gentle invitation to widen definitions. Matter need not shine to exist. Interaction can be limited and still be essential. A universe where the majority of mass is quiet is not hostile. It is generous in another key. It grants stability without noise. It permits delicate structures to endure. It writes its influence on paths and profiles instead of on color and heat. The rules hold, yet the players differ from the early cast imagined when telescopes first learned to gather the night. He finds comfort in the consistency of the numbers. Different methods tell the same story with their own accents. Rotational dynamics, cluster kinematics, gravitational lensing, background radiation, elemental abundances, and the growth of structure each speak a sentence that agrees in tone. Agreement across such distance and technique is a balm to an anxious mind. The universe, while stranger than a first glance suggested, is not arbitrary. It is governed by relations that can be learned, and those relations can be carried in thought like smooth stones that warm in the hand. She lets a final thought settle. The weight that is not seen may never glow for any eye, yet it carries responsibilities that light alone could not shoulder. It bends, it binds, it shapes, it steadies. It asks observers to infer rather than to gaze, to listen for the way orbits hum rather than to wait for sparks. There is rest in accepting that some truths are felt in motion and balance, in the quiet understanding that gravity, and the matter that answers it, can be real without being bright. A calm returns. The night regains its serenity, and the mind that once sought only the visible learns to trust the measured pull of what cannot be seen. He opens an atlas of rotation, not of continents, but of stars and gas, where each spiral galaxy is a seashell scored with velocities. Radio telescopes listen to the 21-centimeter whisper from neutral hydrogen that extends well beyond the bright disk. The outer rings carry messages the starlight does not deliver. Plot the speed against radius, and the lines lift and then stay level across immense distances, as if a hidden hand steadies the outer lanes. The deeper the mapping reaches into the faint outskirts, the more clearly the quiet support appears. Gravity accounts for what the eye cannot count. She turns to low-surface brightness galaxies, delicate disks with feeble starlight, their luminous mass a thin lace against the night. If only their visible matter shaped them, their motions would be timid. Instead, the curves rise with grace, and then ease into broad plateaus, signaling vast halos that outmass their sparse stars by wide margins. These galaxies become laboratories where ordinary matter steps back and the unseen steps forward, not with spectacle but with patient influence. Each data point is a bead on a thread, and the thread traces a story of structure held by a generous reservoir that does not shine. He considers a rule that often appears in the margins of plots: the relation between a galaxy's rotational speed and its luminosity. Faster disks tend to be brighter, an order that hints at a shared formation path. When observers switch to total baryonic mass, the relation tightens and quiets, like a chord resolving. Gas-rich dwarfs fall into place beside massive spirals when the denominator is all the ordinary content. The slope and small scatter speak of a partnership between visible material and the halo that hosts it. The unseen dictates the tempo, the seen learns the tune, and the alignment calms the mind that seeks order. She visits dwarf spheroidal galaxies that drift as faint companions to larger hosts. Their stars are few and dim, their size is modest, yet their internal motions hint at wells deeper than their light suggests. Spectra of individual stars reveal dispersions that would unbind them if only starlight mattered. The inference is unsentimental. A heavy shroud surrounds these tiny systems and keeps them intact against the tides of their parent galaxies. In that shroud, interactions are rare and silent, yet the outcome is firm. Clusters of stars remain families because an invisible bond holds steady under the slow tug of time. He studies gravitational lensing that does not arc light into dramatic rings, but instead adds small distortions across large fields. The technique called weak lensing gathers these gentle shears and stacks them until patterns appear. Around galaxies, there is a statistical halo of influence, stretching farther than images imply. Around clusters, the pattern becomes a tapestry that outlines where mass resides without asking how it glows. Deep surveys turn noise into signal through patience and number, and the result is a map of weight laid over a map of light. The two maps agree in shape only if an unseen component fills in the missing depth. She listens to clusters in a different tongue, the language of hot plasma that scatters microwave photons and paints shadows against the cosmic background. The Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect outlines pressure profiles, while X-ray images reveal temperature and density. Combine these with lensing, and a three-part portrait emerges. Galaxies as seeds of light, gas as the glowing medium, and a dominant mass as the quiet frame. The frame contains most of the structure, even where the gas thins and the galaxies are sparse, and the frame does not radiate. It is present in the equations like a bass line under a melody. He follows the light from distant explosions used as standard candles to measure how space changes with time. The pattern of brightness and redshift draws a curve that does not bow as gravity alone would demand. The distances are a touch larger than expected at given redshifts, as if space keeps a steady habit of easing outward. To understand the depth of that ease, cosmologists combine candlelight with the frozen sound of primordial waves. The scale of those ancient ripples appears as a preferred spacing in the distribution of galaxies, a ruler set by the young universe. Measure that ruler across time, and the history of expansion becomes a calm line traced through the data. She rests on the image of the cosmic microwave background, a sky full of tiny variations that encode the balance of ingredients. Peaks and troughs in the angular power spectrum mark harmonics of sound in the early plasma. Their positions and heights shape a portrait where ordinary matter sits beside a larger, quieter partner in mass, and both are immersed in a still greater, smoother energy that does not clump. When combined with the late-time maps of structure, the portrait narrows the range of possibilities. The percentages are not decorations, they are anchors that hold models in place with gentle authority. He explores the inner shapes of halos that simulations craft in the language of gravity and time. Near the centers, the profiles steepen in some calculations, while observations of dwarfs and low-surface brightness disks sometimes prefer cores that are flatter and kinder. Feedback from star formation, winds and supernovae can heat and stir the central regions, reshaping the wells without breaking the spell of the halo. The conversation between models and measurements is slow and careful. With each round, the fit between curve and profile improves, and the invisible becomes a parameter space with character, rather than a blank field with a name. She watches time delay in lensed quasars, where multiple images flicker with tiny offsets as light takes paths of different length. Measure those delays, model the lens, and the mass distribution in the foreground becomes a detailed sculpture. In some systems, the models require extended halos with specific slopes and ellipticities to match the patience of the light. These clocks set by gravity do not announce themselves. They simply keep time with cosmic precision, and in their keeping they reveal what pulls on them. He studies streams of stars, long ribbons pulled from small galaxies as they orbit larger ones. The streams are sensitive to the contours of the gravitational field they traverse. Tiny clumps in the field can carve gaps and kinks in the ribbons, while a smooth potential leaves them more regular. Astronomers trace these patterns across the sky to infer whether the halo is grainy with substructure or calm and continuous. The presence of many small lumps matches a universe where the invisible collects in myriad small halos that never grew into bright galaxies. Those lumps are the fingerprints of a cold, patient component. She steps into laboratories where detectors wait in purity and cold, listening for taps at rates so low that a single clean event would be a story. The absence of certain signals draws a boundary around what the particles of the unseen can be. Accelerator experiments probe complementary corners of possibility. Astronomers translate these exclusions into priors for their fits, teaching sky and earth to speak a common dialect of restraint. The investigation deepens not only by discovery, but by the narrowing of guesswork. He returns to the broad pattern that emerges when all these strands are braided. Rotation curves insist on halos. Low-surface brightness galaxies showcase them. Dwarfs whisper of deep wells. Weak lensing sketches their reach. Clusters weigh them in 3 media. The background glow and the cosmic ruler set the proportions. Simulations test profiles. Time delays chisel fine structure. Stellar streams reveal subhalos, and detectors refine the character of the unseen. The picture gains relief like a landscape in soft light. Each ridge and valley revealed by a different angle of illumination. She concludes with a plain comfort. The deeper the investigation goes, the more coherent the tapestry becomes. The calm is not born from a single proof, but from a chord among many instruments and scales. Each new method asks a fresh question and receives an answer that fits the others with gentle precision. The unseen becomes less a rumor and more a presence measured from many directions, the way a sleeping body is known by its breath, pulse, and warmth, even in the dark. With that presence outlined, the mind can rest in the knowledge that gravity is speaking clearly, and that listening well has turned the hidden into a map one can carry like a quiet star chart in the pocket of night. He senses the calm edges of understanding give way to a deeper hush where questions collect. Each new measurement tightens the picture, while uncovering seams that do not align, like a tapestry pulled smooth in one corner and wrinkled in another. The unseen mass must be present to hold galaxies together, yet its behavior in the smallest systems begins to resist a single, simple story. In some dwarf galaxies, the inner pull seems too gentle, as if the central density flattens into a core rather than rising into a sharp cusp. In others, the gravity bites more steeply than models predict. The diversity of inner shapes in tiny galaxies grows into a chorus that refuses to sing one note. The same gravity that holds the large-scale web with serene consistency appears to show personality in the smallest rooms. She watches another tension materialize among the faint companions of large galaxies. Simulations that form structures from the invisible sea often produce many small halos, yet the sky displays fewer bright satellites than expected. The missing ones might be too dim to see, or processes like stellar feedback might have kept them from lighting up, but the count nags at the mind like a half-remembered melody. In separate neighborhoods, the brightest dwarfs seem heavier than their light would suggest they have any right to be, an unease given a nickname that speaks to the pride of small giants. The mystery deepens in modest ways, not through catastrophe, but through careful mismatches that persist after each new try at explanation. He turns toward lenses that split the glow of distant sources into multiple images. Their delays and distortions reveal substructure along the path of light. Some lenses require more small clumps in the foreground than straightforward models provide. Others hint at smoother distributions. The pattern is not uniform, and the less uniform it becomes, the harder it is to press all the data into a single mold. Adjusting the properties of the unseen particles can alleviate one set of tensions while worsening another. Cool the particles a touch and small scales smooth out, but then the rich embroidery of the web begins to look too simple. Add interactions among the unseen, and some cores appear with grace, yet the same interactions can blur the larger pattern that matches observation so well. She listens to the search on Earth, where detectors sit in patient darkness. Years pass with exquisite sensitivity, and no definitive knock at the door. Each quiet season forces the theories to shed former favorites. Particles once considered likely are now constrained to regions of parameter space that look less inviting. Collider experiments look for subtle signatures of new sectors and find exclusion contours instead of footholds. The absence of detection is not defeat, yet it writes a question in steady ink. If the unseen mass is built from particles, what kind of particles keep themselves this shy, and how can such shyness be reconciled with the amount of influence they wield on cosmic scales? He shifts focus to the gentle pressure that encourages space to open. The measurements of supernovae, the ancient glow of the early sky, and the preferred spacing of galaxies agree that expansion has a quiet accelerator. Yet the nature of that accelerator sinks into a deeper fog the more precisely it is measured. The simplest version, a constant energy of the vacuum itself, fits the current data with unsettling ease. The simplicity is a trap for the mind, because the predicted magnitude of such energy from known physics overshoots the observed value by a staggering gulf. It is like expecting a tide to drown the shoreline, and instead finding a lake that barely ripples. The question is not only what the pressure is, it is why it is so small, and yet not zero, a balance that looks too exquisite to be accidental and too constant to be a fleeting phase. She names another unease that glows only in the comparison of distant ladders. Different methods of measuring the current rate of expansion prefer values that do not quite meet in the middle. One set of measurements built on the early sky points to a slower present pace. Another set built on the distance to nearby galaxies and supernovae prefers a faster one. Each approach is careful and grounded, yet their harmonies clash. The difference could be a clue that the smooth pressure is not perfectly steady through time, or it could signal unrecognized complexity in the astrophysical rungs that anchor the nearby ladder. The dissonance does not rise to chaos, but it refuses to melt away, and in its refusal the mystery of the outward push grows more intricate. He considers the coincidence that troubles many quiet rooms. The influence of the unseen mass and the smooth pressure occupy comparable shares of the cosmic inventory at this particular epoch. In the deep past, the mass dominated. In the far future, the pressure will run the stage. Today, the two are balanced in a way that sharpens lenses, sculpts structure, and encourages gentle acceleration all at once. A mind that loves proportion longs for a principle that selects this timing. The absence of such a principle leaves the timing exposed to wonder. Why should the age of eyes and questions coincide with a balance this delicate? She follows threads of speculation that try to give the smooth pressure a shape that can change. A slowly rolling field could act like a fluid with negative pressure. Its equation of state might drift softly with time. If so, future surveys could catch that drift by comparing the patterns of clustering and the history of distances with greater precision. Yet each tentative deviation must be weighed against the calm success of a constant value, a dynamical explanation that moves artfully enough to match what is already known risks, becoming a choreography that explains little more than it mimics. The data invite invention and then judge it with kindness and severity in equal measure. He returns to gravity itself and listens to doubts that suggest its familiar form might be incomplete at the largest scales. Revised equations can be written that adjust how bodies attract at long distances. Some of these revisions echo through galaxies in ways that help match certain rotation curves without invoking halos. Yet when those same revisions are asked to reproduce lensing maps, cluster dynamics, the pattern of acoustic peaks, and the evolution of the web across cosmic time, they begin to chafe against the breadth of evidence. The most ambitious attempts must learn to bend light and shape the early plasma with the same grace that the original theory provides. Few alternatives cross that bar without leaving new rifts. She steps into the quiet space between statistics where two parameters talk across a graph. Change the behavior of unseen particles to better fit dwarf galaxies, and the fit to weak lensing might slacken. Alter the smooth pressure to ease the tension in distance measures, and the balance of early peaks may protest. Every lever moves 2 or 3 outcomes at once. The system is a mobile that demands poise. The deeper the data go, the more the poise is tested. The art becomes one of finding a configuration that lets each strand hang in stillness when the others are set in motion. He thinks about time in the far future. If the smooth pressure stays unyielding, structures that are not bound will drift beyond view. The night sky will thin as distant groups depart over horizons set by expansion. That fate rests on a constant that might not be a constant after all. If the pressure strengthens, expansion could hurry into a drama of torn bonds. If the pressure weakens, gravity could regain ground and change the script again. Observers seek small signs of change in the growth of clustering and in the patterns of gravitational lensing across deep time. Every sign so far leans toward the quiet option, yet the faithfulness of the quiet remains a question asked under the breath. She frames the escalation with a gentleness that keeps anxiety away. Instead of a single riddle with a single key, the night reveals a suite of intertwined questions. The unseen mass explains much, and yet does not place every star at ease. The smooth pressure accounts for the widening of space, and yet asks for a scale that theory struggles to justify. Gravitation keeps the script intact, yet is tempted by revisions that allure in one scene and falter in the next. Measurements agree in broad strokes, while whispering disagreements in the details. Each whisper is a thread that could lead to a new room where the map becomes clearer. He lets the combined weight of these tensions settle like soft snow on a field. None of them erase what has been measured with care. All of them invite refinement in instrument, model, and theory. The deepening of the mystery is not a crisis. It is the normal breath of a science that has reached a vista and sees further ranges beyond. The patience that brought the unseen into the ledger becomes the patience that will decide whether particles must be lighter, interactions must be gentler, fields must be more supple, or gravity must be more subtle than first believed. She turns off the last light in the lab and listens to silence as though it were an instrument. In that silence, she hears three promises. Small scales will continue to test the character of the unseen mass. Distances and growth will clarify whether the outward pressure is constant or alive. The harmony among methods will either deepen until the dissonant notes fade, or it will reveal a new harmony that the mind does not yet know to expect. The questions ask softly to be kept in view. They do not rush. They sharpen edges without drawing blood. They invite rest in the knowledge that even as the mystery grows more intricate, it does so with a grace that feels like a lullaby for those who keep watch under the stars. He opens a quiet cabinet of possibilities, each shelf holding a conjecture shaped with care. The first is a family of particles that move with the restraint of snowflakes in deep winter. They interact rarely with light or ordinary matter, yet they answer gravity faithfully. In that family, live candidates with masses that span a wide range, from the heft of heavy quanta to the hush of ultralight waves. The heavier kin drift like pebbles in a stream, colliding almost never, allowing halos to grow and filaments to stretch. Their shyness fits the calm of large-scale structure. Their scarcity of interactions preserves the delicacy of disks. If such particles exist, they thread every galaxy with a patient weight that never glints. She turns a page and finds a different temperament made of fields that oscillate like the slow breathing of a sleeping sea. These are gentle quanta that act not as pellets but as waves, whose crests can overlap in soft interference. In the deepest halos, the wave nature could smooth the center into a rounded core. On larger scales, the same field can collect into the cosmic web without losing its poise. The concept does not force the universe into drama. It asks it to hum at frequencies too low for human senses. In such a picture, the night is a single instrument resonating softly, and galaxies are the chords held by its strings. He lifts a lantern to yet another branch, where rare cousins of known particles stand in the half-light. They carry no electromagnetic charge, and only the faintest kinship with the forces known to govern daily matter. Some might be relics from a very early era, fossils of a temperature long since fallen. Their presence could be felt not through sparks or heat, but through the way they nudge the formation of structure and subtly alter ancient radiation. If one of these quiet relatives is real, the ledger of particles would gain a page for a new sector, a dark family that speaks with gravity and little else. She studies a sketch of particles that recognize each other with a tenderness unseen by ordinary matter. These particles could collide softly among themselves, exchanging momentum like dancers who never step on a toe. In crowded centers of halos, the gentle encounters could redistribute energy and smooth sharp peaks, creating cores that match certain dwarf galaxies without tearing the larger pattern. At the outskirts, where densities are thin, they would remain nearly collisionless, preserving the broad structure that observations admire. It is a theory that lives in gradients and context, strong enough to shape small rooms, delicate enough to leave vast halls intact. He pauses at a closed compartment where compact objects hide, quiet embers that once drew attention as candidates for the unseen mass. Faint stars, wandering planets, ancient remnants, and darker, more private collapses could drift through halos like unseen marbles in a jar. Their combined weight might contribute in certain ranges, especially in corners where gas and dust are scarce. Yet inventories of microlensing events and surveys at many wavelengths place narrow limits on how abundant these compact travelers can be. They may whisper in some places, but they cannot sing the whole song. The weight that holds galaxies steady likely requires a more pervasive substance. She moves from the unseen mass to the calm pressure that urges space to open, and the first possibility arrives with disarming simplicity. The vacuum itself could possess a tiny energy, present in every room and region, the same everywhere and everywhen. This constant would slide into the equations like a still lake that covers every field. It would not clump, it would not vary, it would simply be. The calmness of this idea is unmatched. The difficulty is a question of scale. Known fields suggest a value far larger than what the sky allows, a mismatch that makes theorists speak in whispers. Still, the sky favors this quiet answer whenever the question is put plainly. He unfolds another sheet where a field rolls slowly down a shallow landscape, changing its value so gently that the universe barely notices across eons. Such a field carries negative pressure, an attribute that lets space breathe outward. If it changes with time, the history of expansion will carry its signature. The field need not be capricious. It could be guided by a potential crafted by symmetries that echo through other corners of physics. The appeal lies in flexibility, in the way the field can adjust to fit the measured tempo of distances and growth. Yet flexibility can become indulgence, if not anchored by clear principles. The balance is to supply just enough movement to resolve tensions without inventing more than is needed. She considers a fluid whose pressure depends not only on its height on the landscape, but on the speed with which it rolls. Such a medium could alter how sound travels through it, making the growth of structure feel slighter pushes and stronger resistances at different times. The language here grows more abstract, but the goal remains simple. This fluid would mimic a constant in broad strokes, while offering a gentle deviation where data quietly ask for it. The testing ground for such ideas lies in the faint patterns of how matter clusters and in the bending of light across the deep sky. He turns a page to proposals that let the smoothing influence feel the presence of ordinary matter more directly. The strength of the field could change in dense environments, hiding in galaxies and revealing itself in emptier rooms. In this family, effects remain consistent with what the solar system insists is true while allowing distance measurements and lensing maps to show small departures on grand scales. The theories introduce a choreography where the field alters its steps by the crowding of the venue. The elegance depends on how well that choreography avoids stepping on the rules tested in laboratories and in the motions of nearby planets. She opens a broader atlas where the very script of gravity receives gentle edits. The curvature that bends light and sculpts orbits could be modified at low acceleration or at long distances. Some proposals add terms that become significant only in the quietest stretches of space. Others give mass to the graviton, making the carrier of gravity heavy enough to bow the law over large spans. These ideas must keep a delicate promise. They must preserve the successes of the familiar theory in every place it has been tested while offering relief where tensions gather. The promise is not easily kept. The more art that is added to make the large-scale behavior soften, the more care must be taken so that light still bends in the right arcs, and ancient sound still leaves the correct pattern in the background glow. He sets an index card aside for a possibility that does not rely on a new field or a new rule, but on selection itself. A universe of many patches with many values could exist in a grander quilt. Life would arise only in patches where the smoothing influence is small enough to allow galaxies to condense, but not so small that expansion collapses the canvas. The value then looks tuned, because only tuned regions can host eyes to notice it. The idea is austere. It refuses further mechanism and hands the question to a wider landscape. Its comfort comes from its silence, not from an underlying engine that sings a reason. She steps into the space where the unseen mass and the smoothing pressure might know each other. Perhaps the two are not strangers sharing a ledger, but participants in a shared economy. Energy could move between them through a coupling too subtle for current instruments to track directly. If so, the balance that appears coincidental could be a steady trade rather than a chance meeting. The growth of structures and the pace of expansion would carry the traces of this exchange. Patterns of clustering might differ by just enough to reveal a conversation in the dark. He returns to the halo and imagines it dressed with tiny companions nested within, as small as clouds inside a larger cloud. Some of these substructures might be sprinkled with ordinary matter, others might remain purely dark. If the unseen particles are cold and patient, the number of such clumps is large. If the particles have a softness that blurs small scales, the number falls. The sky could arbitrate by tracing gaps in stellar streams and by listening for faint distortions in the shapes of distant galaxies. In the end, the architecture of halos becomes a script where the properties of the unseen are written in the flourishes and the rests. She continues with a softer notion that the unseen mass may be part of a sector with its own light, its own forces, its own chemistry, conducted entirely out of sight. In that secluded realm, atoms could form using unfamiliar charges, radiating in a spectrum that slips past our instruments. A fraction of the dark sector might even cool and settle into disks misaligned with those of visible matter, leaving imprints in the motions of stars and gas that can be read like palimpsests. The idea borders wonder, yet it remains guided by the same discipline as all the others. If such a sector exists, it must honor every constraint already measured while offering at least one new signature that can be sought. He rests his hand on the final page without turning it. Not every suggestion needs to crowd the night. The virtue of a theory is not its novelty, but its quiet ability to account for what is seen and measured, to do so with minimal invention, and to make predictions that invite new listening. The cabinet of possibilities is not a playground for whims. It is a garden tended by data. Seeds that sprout into sturdy stems remain. Sprouts that falter are removed without haste. Through this slow gardening, the night keeps its composure, while the mind learns to trust that even the boldest speculations must first pass through the gentlest screen of evidence. He walks through a gallery of instruments, each crafted to listen for quiet influences that leave only gentle fingerprints on the sky and in the lab. The first room holds mirrors that drink starlight with a patience perfected by mountain air. Wide fields of view capture millions of galaxies at once, their shapes slightly stretched in a way that reveals the soft shearing of space by intervening mass. The mathematics of weak lensing takes those minute distortions and turns them into maps of gravity's fabric. Each map is a weather chart of the cosmos, contour lines of pull rather than pressure, the image of an invisible architecture assembled from countless faint tilts in distant light. She pauses before a wall covered in spectral lines, thin threads of color that shift by tiny amounts. Redshift surveys sweep through three-dimensional volumes, placing galaxies in a grand atlas where distances are measured by the stretching of light. In the pattern of where galaxies prefer to gather, a faint, regular spacing appears, a memory of sound that once rippled through a hot plasma. That preferred scale becomes a ruler placed across cosmic time. Its tick marks let observers track how steadily space has opened, and whether the pace of that opening has changed. The method is not violent. It is an archaeology of quiet imprints. He moves to clocks so stable that a single second would not drift by more than a breath over the age of the universe. Atomic transitions light up cavities with steady rhythm. Arrays of these clocks test whether time itself keeps the same beat in all places. If the field that lifts distances were to couple ever so slightly to particles, the rhythm might wobble in a way that no human ear could hear, but a clock could catch. The absence of such wobbles becomes a boundary that fences off many ideas and channels effort toward those that respect the stubborn regularity of time. She runs a hand over a model of a satellite with cold eyes. Detectors chilled to near silence observe the sky at microwave wavelengths, counting tiny differences that trace the frozen murmurs of the early universe. The arrangement of those differences across the sky refines the ratios of ingredients with eerie precision. Their statistics set a baseline that any later measurement must honor. If the outward pressure wanders with epoch, its stray steps would echo through the contrast between this ancient portrait and the way matter clusters today. Space-based instruments deliver that portrait with the steadiness of a photograph taken by dawn itself. He examines spectrographs tuned for the distant flare of a single type of stellar cataclysm. Standard candles become yardsticks laid across black oceans. Their peak brightness and characteristic light curves provide distances without relying on other ladders. Compared across redshift, the candles deliver a story of expansion written in the language of brightness. With careful calibration and a stubborn refusal to accept haste, these measurements test whether the calm outward push is constant. The quiet lies not only in the light from the explosions, but in the discipline of correcting for dust, evolution, and selection with methods that leave little room for mischief. She steps into a hall lined with cold metal cylinders buried beneath mountains. Liquids as clear as thought wait for a tap, so rare it might occur only a handful of times in seasons of listening. A particle of the unseen mass, if it traverses the vessel, could leave a tiny nudge in the form of a recoil or a flash of light. Shielding keeps the daily noise away. Analysis prunes every false whisper, and the remaining silence turns into a sentence about what the unseen is not. Each instrument speaks through exclusions, trimming vast fields of possibility down to valleys where truth may reside. He peers at a chamber of crystalline wafers cooled until vibrational chatter hushes. A passing particle might leave a single quantum of heat, a rise so minute it tests the very meaning of detection. The artistry here lies in subtracting every known source of warmth until what remains is either an authentic visitor or the ghost of background. Parallel to these vaults of stillness, resonant cavities sit like musical instruments tuned to the faintest note. Influence from a soft field would deliver photons at a countable pitch. By sweeping frequency and hoarding patience, these haloscopes search for waves that would have passed unnoticed through every age of looking. She lingers at a table with lenses mounted on rails and photodiodes blinking like calm eyes. Beams of light are directed into walls to test whether anything more delicate than photons might slip through and return as itself on the far side. If such conversions occurred, they would betray the presence of a subtle mediator. The experiments run for long hours that fashion their own kind of stillness. Positive results are rare, limits grow tighter. With each improvement, the possible landscape for such mediators shrinks until only a few valleys remain worth exploring. He studies a cluster of images where a single bright source appears multiple times. The delays between those images act as cosmic stopwatches. Measure the lag, model the mass that bends the light, and the rate at which distances grow can be inferred without relying on other calibrations. Strong lensing with time delays is a craft of geometry and patience, a collaboration between telescopes that resolve fine structure and algorithms that honor every photon's path. As the number of such systems grows, the statistical weight of their inference gains composure. Even small disagreements with other methods become signposts toward refinement or novelty. She stands beside a machine that smashes particles together at unthinkable energy, a brief carnival that contrasts with the gentle tone of distant sky work. The drama is confined to nanoseconds, but the aftermath is studied with a calm that takes years. If new families of particles leave traces, they are recognized in jets and missing momentum. The absence of surprise teaches as well. It tells the silent story that the unseen must be more aloof than many once hoped. Theory responds with quieter candidates, and searchers adjust their nets to finer mesh. He pauses at antennas tuned to long wavelengths where hydrogen murmurs. The line at 21 centimeters, when mapped in bulk, becomes a terrain map of matter across wide stretches of time. Intensity mapping treats the signal as a field rather than a catalogue of individual galaxies. It trades detail for reach and gains the ability to chart how structure swells and flows as the smooth pressure and gravity negotiate. The fingerprints of change in that negotiation appear in growth rates and in redshift space distortions, delicate effects that demand large volumes and careful control of foregrounds. The reward is a timeline drawn from the breath of the universe's simplest atom. She walks through a chamber where atoms fall in silence and interfere with themselves. The interference patterns of matter waves respond to tiny accelerations. Arrays of such interferometers can test the pull of gravity at scales and regimes that sit just outside traditional experiments. If gravity bends from its familiar script at grand distances, some echo might be caught here in miniature. The method is a bridge between the tabletop and the sky, a way for precision metrology to converse with cosmology using a shared grammar of phase and time. He stops at a mural that stitches together many layers of the same field. Images in optical light, near infrared, radio, and X-ray register different aspects of structure. Galaxies give the stellar narrative, gas tells the thermodynamic subplot, and lensing provides the independent chorus of total mass. Cross-correlation is the craft of letting these layers sing together. When the harmonies converge, confidence grows that the model chosen is neither overfitted nor naive. When they resist, a clue emerges about biases, systematics, or perhaps genuine novelty. The ongoing work is to improve calibration, to push noise down, and to respect that the universe's calm can hide complexity. She reflects on the choreography of surveys that trade depth for breadth and return again later for time. Some count everything faint in a small patch, others scan wide areas to catch rare giants. Still others watch the same region for years to learn how brightness varies. Together, they let instruments measure both the geometry of space and the growth of structure. Geometry senses how distances respond to the smooth pressure. Growth senses how matter clumps under gravity. Comparing the two is a test of consistency that can reveal whether the outward push is a property of space alone or a sign that gravity's rules need soft correction. He considers the near future taking shape on drawing boards and test stands. Telescopes with larger mirrors and wider cameras will trace fainter shapes. Satellites with more stable platforms will measure background patterns with cleaner noise. Underground detectors will scale to greater masses and lower thresholds. Cavities will become quieter and more agile in frequency. Interferometers will sharpen phase sensitivity. Each advance is small in isolation yet profound in concert. The instruments are converging on the precision needed to distinguish stillness from subtle drift, simplicity from gentle complexity. She closes her eyes and hears what the gallery has been saying all along. Progress is made by listening where the signals are smallest and the temptations for haste are strongest. Tools that listen softly are the guardians of composure. Their reports are patient, their verdicts rarely dramatic. Yet, with time, the edges of uncertainty draw inward. The maps gain relief. The rulers grow steadier. The clocks hold time more surely. The laboratories grow colder and cleaner. Tests that once seemed out of reach become routine hums in the background of a quiet night's work. In that steady improvement lies the promise that the character of the unseen will reveal itself without force, as a figure emerging naturally from a long exposure. He enters a control room at dawn, where screens glow with maps stitched from years of patient looking. The images are too smooth to impress at a glance. Their power lies in numbers written at the bottom of the frame, in covariances and likelihoods that whisper of a world pinned down to narrow corridors. The surveys have become oceans. Wide fields count more galaxies than any mind can hold. Deep exposures pull light from distances that feel like memories. Across wavelengths, the sky is taken in full, its patterns compared and recomposed until only the most durable features remain. The result is a quiet that feels earned, a silence that comes not from emptiness but from agreement. She studies a chart where contours shrink gently around preferred values. Each season of observation tightens them, and the effect is like a lens coming into focus. Measurements of cosmic shear draw their ellipses. Acoustic rulers set by ancient sound draw theirs. Distances from steady beacons add another shape. The overlap of these shapes is not a place on a map, but a state of mind where confidence increases without raising its voice. She watches the ellipses touch, then intersect, then nest inside one another. The walls they form are not cages, they are guardrails that keep fantasy from straying into daydream. He listens to statistics doing their soft work. Noise is another kind of weather, and the surveys have become experts at predicting it. Foregrounds are modelled with care. Systematics are tracked like footprints in snow and then brushed away without disturbing the drift. The remaining signal is small but persistent across instruments, methods, and teams. That repetition is a lullaby. It assures that the way light bends, the way galaxies cluster, the way distances scale, is not a conjuration of software or a habit of a single device. It is the universe speaking, and the tone does not waver. She follows a stream of data from a spectrograph, cycling through redshifts like a metronome. In 3 dimensions, the pattern of galaxies is a sponge of bright knots and empty rooms. A faint preference for a certain separation appears, the fossil of pressure waves that once combed a young plasma. The imprint acts as a ruler that does not age. Placed again and again at different depths, it shows how the stage has stretched. The stretching is steady to a degree that invites relaxation. Where anxiety would expect irregularities and stutters, the data report a calm expansion with only the smallest room for drift. He drifts to a screen devoted to the temperature and polarization of a background that belongs to the infancy of everything. The map looks like freckled porcelain. Its statistics are so well known that deviations would stand out like a red bird in snow. The maps do not shock, they reassure. They set a composition where ordinary matter is a modest slice, where the unseen mass is a generous portion, where a smooth pressure fills the rest. Later surveys must fit inside this frame. They do, almost perfectly, and the almost becomes the center of attention. In that almost resides the hope for novelty, or the discipline to acknowledge that the world is coherent. She contemplates the flaw that nature places under the noise. There is a level below which uncertainty will not sink, no matter how many galaxies are counted or how clean the optics become. It is called a variance, written into the cosmos itself, the limit imposed by the fact that only one universe is available to measure. The calm acceptance of that flaw changes the tone of ambition. Rather than chase impossible perfection, teams learn to approach the limit with grace. They accept that the final whisper from the sky will still have a tremble. The tremble is not a failure, it is a signature. He looks at another wall where null results are framed, like artworks. Each panel shows a search that found no unexpected glow, no new force's footprint, no extra wiggle in a familiar curve. The frames are not defeats, they are coordinates. They remove acres of possibility and leave behind paths that are narrower and more plausible. Patience finds poetry in such absences. A species that learned to love fireworks must now learn to love restraint. The night gives most of its answers in the form of boundaries. Those boundaries are gifts. She watches the growth of structure across time unfold as a sequence of increasingly detailed relief maps. Early on, the web is faint. Later, filaments thicken and nodes brighten. The surveys follow this growth like a botanist following a tree through seasons. The rate at which the web fattens becomes an index sensitive to both gravity and the smooth pressure that pulls everything gently apart. If the law that governs attraction were different in the quietest reaches, or if the pressure drifted with epoch, the growth would tilt, the timing would shift, the geometry and clustering would disagree. The maps look calm, as if gravity and pressure have signed a truce whose terms are simple and steady. He lingers at a table where catalogues are cross-matched with patient care. One survey identifies shapes, another measures colors, a third records velocities, a fourth listens for the echo of sparse hydrogen. Together they create a multi-layered portrait where each layer corrects and confirms the others. Correlations across these layers catch subtle biases and then subtract them. The residuals are small and consistent. They point to a universe that is surprisingly well behaved, one that accepts simple parameters with an elegance that feels like kindness. She stands before a visualization of halos within halos, the substructure revealed by analyses that would have been impossible when the century was young. Ribbons of torn stars act as seismographs. Lensing adds texture where light offers none. Simulations are carried forward in lockstep with these revelations and are tuned less by hope than by restraint. When they are honest about feedback, honest about resolution, honest about the limits of their assumptions, a closer harmony emerges. The unseen halo becomes more than a sketch. It becomes a landscape where travelers can predict where the ground will rise and where it will level. He visits a quiet corner where disagreements sit like small stones in a stream. A measure of expansion here, a measure of clustering there, each with its own uncertainties, its own selection functions, its own ways to make mistakes. The stones are noticeable, but they do not stop the flow. To focus on them alone would be to forget the river that passes around them without complaint. Work continues to smooth the stones, or to learn that they are not errors at all, but hints of a new texture in the bedrock. Either way, the current speaks of continuity. She looks up at a list of future campaigns already being planned. They promise statistics so vast that cosmic variance will be the main opponent. They promise imaging so stable that distortions at the level of a fraction of a percent become reliable metrics. They promise spectroscopy so fast that millions of redshifts become routine. The promises are not loud. They are written in timelines and budgets and calibration strategies that aim for patience rather than heroics. The vision is simple. Let data of unmatched quality decide whether the whisper is constant or carries a quaver too subtle to have been heard before. He thinks about how much of the unknown can live comfortably inside the known. The unseen mass can be colder or softer by a small degree and still match the sky that has been painted. The smooth pressure can be almost constant and still soothe the fit to distances. If novelty exists, the surveys suggest it will be a gentle one, a feather on the scale rather than a new scale altogether. That realization is calming. It replaces the anxiety of grand upheaval with the serenity of refinement. The world does not need to overturn itself to be interesting. It needs to reveal the small misalignments that teach more than shocks do. She finishes by resting her gaze on a simple table where 4 numbers sit with uncertainties that have become thin as leaves. They describe the pace of expansion, the density of ordinary matter, the share belonging to the unseen, and the amplitude of clustering. These numbers are not absolutes. They are summaries, compressions of immense labor into compact truths. The deeper the surveys go, the more those summaries resist change. That resistance is not stubbornness, it is maturity. A field that has reached this quiet learns to listen for the faintest hints of difference and to accept with grace when difference refuses to speak. The silence that remains after such listening is not empty. It is full of reassurance that the architecture sketched by gravity is coherent across methods, across epochs, across wavelengths. It is full of the knowledge that the smooth pressure behaves with a steadiness that allows the mind to rest without clutching. It is full of the understanding that if the dark sector speaks, it will do so softly, through a deviation measured at 3 standard deviations after a decade of care, not through a scream. In that patience lies the mood that lets eyes close easily. The universe appears content to keep its secrets wrapped in consistency, and consistency, when achieved across the largest canvas, is a lullaby. He spreads a star chart across a table and watches the ink swells join like rivers seeking a sea. The pattern that emerges is not a random sprinkle, but a lacework. Filaments stretch across hundreds of millions of light years, thickening where they cross into bright knots that host clusters. Between the threads lie rooms so large and quiet that a single galaxy could drift for eons without greeting a neighbor. The eye follows a single strand and finds that it is not a line at all but a braided cord, multiple streams of matter flowing together, carrying galaxies as leaves upon a slow current. Gravity writes the script, yet the handwriting is light and patient, as if a steady hand drew the web in one long breath. She lingers at a filament's edge, where a faint fog of gas trails the invisible scaffold. Shock fronts warm the medium to soft X-ray temperatures, while colder rivers slip along protected channels toward cluster cores. The material arriving does not fall like a stone. It spirals, it delays, it pauses at way stations where small groups gather and merge. In that spiral, galaxies feel tides that torque their spins, flipping orientations by gentle degrees. The memory of those flips lives in the alignment of disks and halos, imprinted by the tidal field that squeezes one axis while letting another stretch. The web shapes not only where galaxies live, but how they face the wind. He considers a void as a calm lake cradled by higher shores. At first the lake is small. As time passes, water runs outward to the rims, while the center thins and cools. Galaxies that remain inside these rooms grow slowly, unbothered by crowds, free to keep their gas and form stars at leisure. Their colors tend toward youth, their disks toward symmetry, their motions toward gentleness. Observers mapping their positions draw circles so large that the mind staggers, yet the circles feel soft, without hard walls, only gradients of less and more. The expansion inside a void behaves like a local sigh, a relaxation that empties the center and lifts the edges. She walks along a filament toward a cluster where the temperature rises and the breeze stiffens. The intracluster medium is a sea of plasma that bathes the galaxies in heat. As newcomers plunge through, their gas can be swept away by pressure. a quiet stripping that quenches future growth. The stars remain as witnesses, their orbits reshaped by encounters, their envelopes puffed by tides. In the brightest corners, starlight spills into a pale halo that no single galaxy can claim. That diffuse glow is the record of many small partings, a memoir written by orphaned stars that now drift between worlds. He watches the web grow in a simulation that treats gravity with infinite patience. At early times, the field is a rippled plain. Mass flows along the steepest slopes, forming sheets like frost on glass. Where sheets cross, they make filaments. Where filaments cross, they sink into nodes. The unfolding is elegant, an origami of collapse. Caustics appear as lines of folded phase space, places where streams overlap without mixing. The concept is abstract, yet the outcome is visible in arcs of satellites and in shells around elliptical galaxies, signatures of past passages through crowded intersections. She returns to the voids and considers their boundaries as laboratories where gravity's summations can be read in clean script. The gravitational field inside is close to uniform, so small deviations stand out. A little overdensity on a rim can organize the orbits of nearby dwarfs, turning random paths into a coordinated drift. Lines of sight across these basins reveal peculiar velocities that add to the universal swell, sculpting anisotropies in redshift space that resemble squashed balloons and elongated trumpets. By measuring those shapes, the pull of the web's gentle tides becomes numbers on a page, and numbers become a story of how structure grows under a calm law. He follows cold streams that thread into halos like transparent veins. In massive systems, these streams can penetrate the hot atmosphere and deliver fuel directly to central disks. The inflow is quiet, a laminar glide along paths laid by the dark scaffold. Where the streams converge, they kindle rings and bars, internal engines that move angular momentum outward and let new stars condense in steady seasons. The disk that results is neither a brief flame nor a sluggish ember. It is a hearth that burns with balance, fed by slender channels that the eye cannot see, and yet the chemistry of stars can remember. She studies alignments that reveal the hidden tension in the fabric. Satellite systems prefer orbits that trace a filament's direction. Star-forming spirals tend to point their spin axes across the surrounding thread, while massive ellipticals often align more along it. These trends are modest, washed by noise, yet persistent across volumes. They are the fingerprints of the tides that sculpted the flows. The web is not merely a scaffold holding static ornaments. It is a dance floor, where steps have memory, and partners learn the steps by feeling the floor's grain beneath their feet. He contemplates the outskirts of halos where gravity is still persuasive but polite. Ribbons of stars pulled from smaller companions wind as pale streams. Each ribbon is a seismograph. If a small lump of unseen matter passes nearby, a notch appears in the stream, a gap that testifies to a brief encounter. In smooth models, gaps are rare. In clumpy models, they multiply. By counting and sizing these interruptions across the sky, observers infer how granular the halo is, how many small islands drift without lights, how finely the scaffolding is carved. It is a reading of the web's texture by touch rather than by sight. She looks at the way gas cools and warms along the threads. Where density is modest and shocks are soft, hydrogen carries a whispering temperature, allowing molecules to form and clouds to condense. In harsher stretches, galactic winds sweep back along the filaments, returning metals to the medium that once fed them, a slow circulation that enriches future generations. The feedback is not a storm that tears the web. It is a breathing cycle that respects the larger architecture. The web endures while the local weather varies, and the endurance allows galaxies to settle into temperaments shaped as much by their address as by their mass. He listens to the flow of peculiar velocities, motions over and above the global expansion. They are small ripples on a broad tide, yet they carry information about the slope of the gravitational potential. Where filaments slide into nodes, the ripples add up and grow, forming rivers that can be traced statistically. By comparing these flows with the observed distribution of mass, one can check whether the pull and the response remain faithful to the expected relation. So far, the faithfulness is impressive. If there is a departure, it hides in margins that require careful patience to reveal. She pauses at a map where the web is drawn, not by starlight but by absorption, a forest of lines etched into the spectra of distant quasars. Each line marks a cloud or filament of cooler gas between the lamp and the observer. The collection of these marks along many sightlines makes a topography that matches the scaffold glimpsed by other means. It is a version of the web traced by breath rather than by bone. Where the density rises, the marks cluster. Where a void opens, they thin. The agreement across tracers creates a confidence that does not need proclamation. He thinks of time and how the web carries memory forward. A galaxy that fell along one thread tends to find the next merger along the same path. The direction of approach, the orientation of the disk, the tilt of the halo, all retain echoes of the route taken. This inertia of context explains why certain structures repeat, why bars and rings recur, why shells appear at predictable radii. It is not fate, but it is guidance, a quiet preference that adds coherence to histories that would otherwise be noisier. She imagines a traveller stationed in a void, looking outward toward the nearest wall of galaxies. The sky would show a thin arch in one direction, a fainter arc beyond, and darkness elsewhere. Navigation would be simple. Head toward the arch, and one eventually reaches a crossroads where multiple threads meet. In that journey, the traveller would feel a gradual increase in encounters, temperatures, and tides. The contrast between void and wall maps directly onto states of rest and stir. The cosmos offers neighborhoods of deep peace and others of sociable closeness, and the balance between them makes the whole habitable for complexity. He returns to the nodes, where clusters rule, and listens for the faint winds that galaxies drive into the surrounding medium. These outflows are not hurricanes. They are exhalations that spread warmth and metals into the outskirts, altering the cooling of gas that will later rain back through filaments. The loop closes over billions of years. Material cycles between galaxies and the web, between stars and the medium that cradles them, between nodes and the roads that lead in. The quiet exchange ensures that metallicity gradients evolve, that star formation histories carry gentle rises and falls, that the palette of colors across a filament broadens with time. She rests on a simple realization. The web and the voids are a compromise between two tendencies. Gravity wants to gather, smooth pressure wants to ease separations. Together they produce a pattern neither would make alone, a countryside of ridges and basins laid over an expanding land. In that countryside, galaxies find homes suited to their needs. Some flourish in bustling towns at intersections. Some prefer cottages along quiet lanes. Some seek solitude in broad meadows, where the nearest neighbor is an idea more than a presence. The variety calms the thought that the universe demands one way of being. It does not. It offers a landscape and lets travelers choose a path. He closes the chart and sees the pattern linger in the mind, like a melody that can be hummed without an instrument. The notes are simple. Threads connect, basins breathe, nodes gather, streams wind, and tides remember. Each note repeats across scales with variations that keep the ear attentive. The harmony never shouts. It asks the listener to lean in and, in leaning, to relax. The unseen scaffold does its work without show, letting light trace arabesques upon it. The result is a portrait of connection and rest, of movement and repose, of pulls so quiet that they feel like the steady pulse of sleep. He opens a quiet ledger of candidates, each entry a different way the universe could hide weight. The first family carries a simple story about the early heat. In that story, particles once jostled among protons and electrons with ordinary vigor. As the fireball cooled, these candidates fell out of step, their collisions too rare to keep up with the crowd. Their abundance froze to a relic level set by the rate at which they once found and destroyed each other. If the interaction strength sat near a familiar scale, the relic abundance would, by a curious grace, match the mass required to hold galaxies steady. The tale is tidy, and its elegance has kept it on the table. The particles themselves would be heavy by atomic standards, neutral and invisible to light, yet they would still feel a faint pull from the weak force or a cousin of it. Their presence would be seen only when they nudge a nucleus or when their kin are created in high-energy collisions that end with missing energy slipping away. She turns to a gentler personality, a field that fills space like a low note held for an age. Imagine a quantity that wants to sit at zero, but that was set a little off-center when the hot universe cooled through a special transition. As space expanded, the field began to roll toward rest and to oscillate with a long period. Those oscillations act like a sea of particles with feather-light mass. They move so slowly that their wave character becomes important on galactic scales. In the centers of small halos, the interference of these waves can produce a smooth core rather than a sharp spike. The same waves can suppress the formation of tiny clumps, easing some tensions that arise when small scales look too busy in simple models. Production of this sea requires no friction with the hot plasma, only the misalignment of a field that later found its calm. He considers a cousin of that gentle field, born to solve a puzzle in nuclear physics and then adopted by cosmology for its quiet competence. Its interactions with light and matter are so faint that whole mountains can be placed between the field and a detector without dimming its passage. Yet those interactions are not zero. Subtle conversion into microwave photons in a magnetic cavity would be a signature as distinct as a single note played in a silent hall. The frequency to search depends on the field's mass, and the mass spans a range wide enough that the search has become a long sweep across possibility. The patience required feels appropriate for a candidate that prides itself on serenity. She turns a page and finds a shy relative of familiar neutrinos. The known neutrinos come in 3 flavors that mix and trade identities. A 4th flavor could exist that interacts even more faintly, ignoring the standard forces except gravity and perhaps a veiled portal. If this 4th variety is heavier than its cousins, it could contribute to the unseen mass. Yet its presence would leave fingerprints on the growth of structure, on how radiation and matter juggled authority in the early universe, and on how galaxies cluster today. Those fingerprints restrict how abundant such a cousin can be, and how quickly it would need to decay, if it decays at all. The room for this candidate remains, but the furniture must be arranged with care. He pauses at the notion that the unseen may communicate among itself with a language unknown to ordinary matter. Imagine particles that feel their own version of light, a dark photon that carries a force with its own charge. The dark charges could allow gentle scattering among the unseen, altering the density profiles in crowded centers while leaving the outskirts nearly untouched. If the dark photon mixes slightly with the familiar photon, a bridge appears. Through that bridge, rare conversions and small energy leaks might be noticed in devices crafted for exquisite sensitivity. Entire chemical families could flourish in this hidden sector, bound by dark charges, cooling by dark radiation, shaping substructures in ways that only precise stellar motions would betray. She turns to the arithmetic of production. Thermal freeze-out is the neat story of a dance that ends when the hall thins. There is also the quieter idea of freeze-in, where particles so aloof that they never reached equilibrium are nevertheless produced in tiny amounts by the decays and scatterings of the visible world. Over billions of years, this trickle fills a reservoir to the level required by cosmic structure. The signature of such a process is humility. The interactions are so weak that direct detection is a rare hope, yet cosmology can still infer their presence by the large-scale architecture that forms under their weight. He looks upon the possibility that extra dimensions contribute a stack of heavy echoes. In certain theories, particles acquire partners that correspond to motion in compact directions hidden from coarse senses. The lightest of these Kaluza-Klein modes could be stable, becoming a relic that drifts unseen. Their masses and couplings depend on the size and shape of the hidden directions. Colliders might briefly awaken them, astrophysical objects might feel their cooling, and cosmological structure would react to their inertia. The framework is bold, yet it can be made to speak softly when compared with the tenderness of the sky. She returns to the smallest scales where the character of the unseen becomes a craft of sculpting. If the particles are very light and warm at early times, they free stream and erase small seeds before gravity can amplify them. The suppression leaves a signature in the number of faint galaxies, in the lacing of the hydrogen forest, and in the shape of the lowest mass halos that survive. Measurements of these features act as rulers that cut away warm options that would smear the universe more than is seen. The survivors are those candidates that remain cool enough to preserve the fine grain. He visits an idea where the unseen is not a single kind of particle, but a community. Some members could be heavier, forming the backbone of halos. Others could be lighter, acting as a bath that affects how the heavier ones distribute in crowded cores. A small fraction could even interact with ordinary matter through a portal that carries a new quantum number, creating subtle imprints in stellar cooling or in the timing of pulsars. This plural notion mirrors the complexity of the visible sector, where families, forces, and generations coexist. If nature repeats its fondness for variety, the dark sector may prove to be a miniature world with its own quiet ecology. She returns to the practicality of signs. Candidates that talk to nuclei produce tiny recoils in crystals or liquid noble elements. Those that talk to electrons leave a whisper of ionization. Wave-like fields deposit photons at specific frequencies. Interacting dark sectors could create bumps in cosmic background spectra or slight deviations in Big Bang nucleosynthesis yields. Heavier relics forged in early anomalies could seed tiny antimatter islands or change the behavior of compact stars. Each possibility leaves a pattern that can be translated into a survey strategy, a target material, a frequency band, a timing campaign. The landscape is broad, yet it is not indefinite. Counting rules apply, and every new probe trims the edges. He thinks of a constraint that arrives from a quieter quarter. The shapes of galaxies and clusters can be blurred by frequent self-interactions. Ellipticity in their outer regions sets upper limits on how often unseen particles can scatter. Meanwhile, colliding clusters that passed through one another like ghosts, with gas lagging behind, set complementary bounds. Candidates that scatter too much are asked to step aside. Candidates that never brush past one another at all are asked to explain the gentleness of cores in small halos. The viable range becomes a window that hints at a cross-section small enough to deserve the name dark, yet large enough to matter where densities climb. She returns to a field that couples to electromagnetism during the early plasma epoch and temporarily changes the propagation of light. If such a coupling toggled for a brief era, it could leave an imprint on polarization or on the phases of acoustic peaks. After that era, the field could decouple and act as a standard relic. Finding such a signature would feel like discovering a note scribbled in a margin long ago, a fleeting message from a brief conversation between sectors that now keep their distance. He closes the ledger with a feeling that resembles contentment rather than conclusion. A good candidate has simple birth, graceful survival, and modest effects that nevertheless add up to the strength required. It respects the scaffold drawn by structure, the limits spoken by light, the patience of clocks, and the muteness of entire caverns of detectors. It offers at least one clear way to be found, even if the path is long, even if the signal is quiet. The search continues not from desperation, but from the confidence that the cosmic web, the bending of distant arcs, and the slow spin of outer stars are not illusions, they are invitations. The particles that answer them will enter the story when patience becomes precision, and precision, at last, becomes recognition. He opens a notebook where pressure is written as something that can be negative, a gentle insistence that volume prefers to grow. On the first page stands a simple constant, a uniform energy that fills every region with the same quiet. Its pressure is the mirror of its density, and that balance encourages distance to widen with steady poise. The constant demands no dynamics, offers no waves, and leaves no ripples in the ledger of clustering. It is the still lake version of cosmic influence, perfectly flat, perfectly calm, and hard to argue with except for the scale at which it must sit. She turns the page to a field that rolls, slow as dusk. This field behaves like a fluid whose pressure depends on how high it rests on a shallow landscape. If the slope is gentle, it descends almost imperceptibly, so the pressure remains negative but not exactly fixed. The equation of state becomes a quiet meter that can drift with time. In such a world, the history of distances would differ by small degrees from the constant case. The field might cluster a little or not at all, depending on how fast disturbances travel through it. If its sound speed is near light, it stays smooth, almost like the constant. If slower, it could leave faint fingerprints in the growth of structure, a hush audible only to the most patient surveys. He studies a variant in which the field cares not only where it sits, but how quickly it moves. In this picture, the kinetic energy is altered in a way that lets pressure respond to motion with a richer grammar. Fluctuations may propagate at speeds above or below the usual limit, though causality keeps them polite. The point is not drama. It is flexibility enough to follow the data where a constant might be too rigid. The cost of that flexibility is discipline in the form of stability conditions that must be respected. The field cannot allow ghosts or gradient instabilities. It must sing within a narrow register where the physics remains well posed. She considers a force that is shy in crowded rooms and expressive in open halls. If the field couples to matter, it risks conflict with the precision of planetary motions. Screening becomes its refuge. In dense environments, the effective mass of the field can rise until its range shrinks, leaving laboratory tests untouched. In emptier spaces, the mass drops and the field stretches its influence over cosmological volumes. This chameleon behavior allows a new force to hide in the solar system while still guiding the expansion in the deep. The signatures are subtle, small shifts in how structures grow, gentle changes in the relation between the motion of galaxies and the bending of light. He inspects another screening idea that is geometric rather than chameleonic. Nonlinear self-interactions of the field can curb its own gradient near massive bodies, turning the extra pull-off without making the field heavy. Far from sources, the interaction relaxes and the force emerges again. The result is a theory that respects local tests while adding softness to the large-scale law. Observers would see a slight mismatch between the potential that moves matter and the potential that lenses light, a gravitational slip that can be read by comparing galaxy velocities with weak lensing maps. The difference is only a few percent in many constructions, but in a discipline built on patience, a few percent feels like an enunciation. She turns to modified curvature, a family of proposals that alters how geometry responds to stress. In these ideas, the action that yields the field equations is dressed with extra functions of curvature. The additional terms become important in low-density regimes, imitating a smooth pressure without adding a separate fluid. The theory must pass a gauntlet. It must recreate the successes of gravity in strong fields. It must avoid superluminal troubles. It must keep instabilities at bay. And it must predict a growth history that does not stray far from what wide surveys have painted. On the page, the equations look compact, but keeping them healthy across scales is a craft of balance. He pauses at a notion where gravity travels through space like a messenger with a small weight. If the carrier has mass, the inverse square law tilts at long distances, and the potential acquires a cutoff or a gentle change of slope. The change can simulate a smooth pressure by weakening attraction only where volumes are grand. The viability of this thought depends on how waves of gravity move. If their speed differs from that of light, astronomers would notice the arrival times of paired flashes and tremors. If their dispersion is strong, waveforms would distort en route. The lesson from the sky is austere. Any model that keeps gravity waves loyal to light in speed, yet allows long-distance softness, must thread a narrow pass. She contemplates an emergent view in which gravity is not fundamental, but an effective description of entanglement and information. In such a picture, an additional elastic response could appear on very large scales, creating an apparent extra pull inside galaxies and clusters without new particles. The hypothesis is graceful as philosophy, proposing that dark effects are echoes of microscopic bookkeeping. Translating the grace into precise predictions is the challenge. Where the ideas give numbers, they must match the delicate curves of rotation, the arcs of lensing, and the statistics of clustering. Any mismatch becomes a stern tutor. He returns to fluids that attempt to unify the unseen mass and the smooth pressure. A single medium could act like pressureless matter where densities are high, then like a negative pressure component where densities are low. The transition would be governed by an equation of state that changes with scale or environment. Such a fluid simplifies the inventory but complicates dynamics. It must reproduce the cosmic web while also letting distances grow with the measured pace. It must avoid sound waves that are too lively, for those would imprint oscillations in structures that the sky does not show. The reward, if achieved, would be an economy that explains two faces with one substance. She opens a page devoted to sequestering schemes that try to cancel most of the vacuum energy without touching the ordinary physics of fields. In these constructions, global constraints act like bookkeepers that remove bulk contributions from the cosmic balance. The surviving small residue then plays the role of the calm pressure that expands space. The approach speaks to the oldest unease in the constant picture, the mismatch between naive field sums and the observed scale. Implementing the bookkeeping while preserving locality and causality is a demanding task. It asks the universe to carry a ledger that is both global in reach and modest in effect. He studies the way the sky judges these forces, not by taste but by consistency. A constant predicts a specific relation between geometry and growth. A rolling field predicts another. A modification of gravity predicts a slip between lensing and motion. The tests are laid out as pairs, triangles, and quadrilaterals of measurements that must close within uncertainties. Galaxy clustering gives a growth rate. Redshift space distortions offer velocities. Weak lensing delivers the summed potential. Standard candles and rulers yield distances. If all corners meet, the force in question passes the round. If a gap appears, the theory must explain why. She listens to the instruction given by waves that ripple through the fabric. The travel time of gravitational waves across vast spans, their lack of dispersion at the measured frequencies, and their agreement with light in speed tighten bands around many ideas. The lesson is quiet but strong. Changes to gravity on large scales must not upset the swift equality between transient light and transient curvature. Models that once enjoyed roomy parameter spaces now live in slender corridors. The corridors are not closed. They are simply narrow enough to demand respect. He turns to the shape of halos as a proving ground for self-interacting forces in the dark. If interactions are frequent, central densities relax into cores, the number of satellites declines, and merger histories change in subtle ways. If interactions are rare, cusps remain and substructure abounds. Both outcomes can match portions of the data, but the global fit requires a cross-section that varies with velocity, small in clusters, larger in dwarfs. Forces that mediate such behavior can be built with light carriers and hidden charges, yet they must slip past all laboratory tests and stellar cooling constraints. The viable region remains, carved thin by many chisels. She reflects on the kinship between explanation and restraint. A theory of forces earns trust by needing little more than the data demand. It should add a small number of degrees of freedom, tether them to a simple principle, and offer concrete predictions that can be distinguished from the constant case by surveys that are already planned. In the quiet of this standard, many proposals simplify or step aside. Those that remain promise deviations only at the level of a few percent in growth indices, in the rate at which structures assemble, in the relation between lensing and motion, or in the way distant rulers appear. He closes the notebook and leaves it on the table with the sense that the cosmos may prefer the simplest melody, a constant that hums beneath every other sound. Yet the openness to a softer instrument remains, a field that rolls almost imperceptibly, a force that hides in crowds and appears in solitude, a curvature that learns a new response at the faintest accelerations. All could be true if the evidence asks for them. The sky will decide through patient comparisons, through cross-checks that do not depend on any single technique. Until then, the possible forces rest like quiet candidates in a well-lit room, each ready to step forward only when data call its name with calm clarity. He steps onto a mezzanine that overlooks a floor of quiet craft. Racks of electronics glow like a constellation made of diodes. Cables fall in gentle arcs. Engineers speak in low voices about calibrations, tolerances, and drift. The science here moves not in leaps, but in increments measured against standards that rarely change. A lamp with stable output floods a camera to teach it uniformity. A grid etched with stars is slid across the field to learn how optics shear and blur. Mirrors are washed, sensors cooled, timing synchronized. Every act is a hymn to the idea that the faintest signals can be trusted only when every layer between sky and number has learned to keep its place. She watches a camera take a flat field, a calibration image that reveals dust motes and pixel quirks. Then a dark frame records the sensor's own whisper when no photon arrives. Later, nightly observations are bracketed with standard stars whose colors and brightness tie the instrument to a common scale. Point spread functions are modeled not with one shape, but with fields of shapes that evolve across the focal plane. Shear biases are estimated through end-to-end simulations that pass artificial galaxies through the same pipeline as the real ones. The goal is not perfection. The goal is a ledger of small corrections, each honest and repeatable, that reduces uncertainty without hiding it. He descends to a room where computers lean into the task of catching errors that look like truths. Blinding is a practice here. Analysts hide the final normalization factors that would reveal a coveted result while they develop cuts, weights, and models. Only when tests against simulated skies and null maps are passed do they lift the last veil. Jackknives are performed by splitting the data into halves and checking whether the halves agree within noise. Rotations are applied to galaxy shapes that should erase real lensing while leaving systematics behind. Cross-correlations are repeated with independent catalogues built by different teams. The discipline is deliberate. It is designed to damp the human tendency to see what is hoped for. She pauses at a bench, laden with detectors that listen for soundless taps. Superconducting sensors are cooled until resistance vanishes and tiny energy deposits alter a phase or a frequency instead of a current. Transition edge devices sit at the brink between superconducting and normal states, so that a single quantum of heat is enough to tip them. Microwave kinetic inductance detectors sense changes in the inertia of paired electrons. Quantum amplifiers lift these small signals without drowning them in their own noise. Materials are purified, surfaces polished, radioactivity mapped down to the trace levels present in concrete and air. A box of silence is made inside a world that vibrates and decays. He walks through a hall where clocks keep time with obstinate grace. Lattices of cold atoms trap and count oscillations that do not waver across months of listening. Fiber links stitch continents into one instrument, sharing phase so that distant clocks can compare their beats. The network can test whether time flows with the same indifference to direction everywhere. It can search for hints of a field that tugs on constants so delicately that only long records will betray the pull. The same discipline that steadies the clocks also steadies the distance scales used by observatories that require nanosecond certainty to combine light gathered thousands of kilometers apart. She studies a wall of interferograms from arrays that treat the atmosphere like a fickle lens. Corrections are computed in real time so that waves arriving at separate dishes add as if the air were crystal. At long wavelengths, these arrays map the breadth of neutral hydrogen as a function of redshift, assembling a chronicle of structure growth without needing to resolve single galaxies. At short wavelengths, very long baselines draw shadows around compact masses and reveal arcs that betray tiny clumps in halos. In both regimes, the art is coherence, keeping phase stable so that additions and cancellations mean what they should. He stops by a lab where atom interferometers hang like metronomes. Beams of matter split, take different paths, and recombine, their phase sensitive to accelerations so small that the pull of passing weather fronts can be felt. Arrays of these instruments can map gradients in gravity over baselines of kilometers, testing whether the force remains indifferent to composition and distance in regimes rarely explored. Their readings complement the sky by asking gravity to explain itself on the ground with the same steadiness it shows in the heavens. She looks in on a control room dedicated to transients. The schedule is a quilt that can rearrange itself at a moment's notice. When a distant flare brightens, messages ripple through a network. Optical telescopes swivel, radio dishes retune, X-ray eyes open, infrared spectrographs stretch to catch the cooling embers. Time delay lenses flicker with structure, host galaxies pull into view. The choreography is practiced so that nothing is missed. Each event becomes a cross-check for distance scales, a probe of the medium between, a calibration of standard candles, a test of how well software can point a fleet of instruments without panic. He stands before a server rack, labeled with the word pipeline in careful letters. Raw pixels arrive as torrents. They are cleaned, aligned, and stacked. Catalogs are built with algorithms that classify stars, galaxies, and artifacts by probability. Colors are measured in matched apertures. Redshifts are estimated from templates or learned by models trained on spectra. Throughout, uncertainty is never a single number. It is a distribution carried forward so that later inferences know exactly what was believed and how confidently. The pipeline is not an assembly line that stamps identical parts. It is a river that remembers every eddy. She studies the page where systematics are written as characters in a play. Atmospheric seeing is a soft actor that broadens. Intrinsic alignments are social actors that bias shapes by shared history. Stellar contamination is a stray actor that interrupts a scene. Each is given a parameter, a prior, a role. Their lines are constrained by auxiliary data and by the requirement that independent tracers agree. Models that forget to cast these actors produce dazzling fits that cannot survive a second reading. Models that include them arrive at answers that are less dramatic and far more likely to be true. He enters a quiet chamber where cryogenic stages hum. Vibrations are damped by suspensions that move like willow branches in a light breeze. Heat is carried away by pulsed tubes that bring temperatures to fractions of a degree above absolute zero. The purpose is not spectacle, but a background reduced to the point where a single recoil, a single photon, a single phonon can be named without doubt. Shielding closes around the apparatus in concentric shells, each shell tuned to a different nuisance. The experimenters keep a diary of the environment, noting cosmic ray bursts, power fluctuations, seismic noise. When a candidate signal appears, the diary is consulted as carefully as the data. She watches arrays used for timing distant pulsars, clocks scattered through the galaxy whose ticks cross the Earth in a drizzle of perfectly spaced pulses. Tiny deviations in their arrival times reveal long waves stretching across space. Those waves can test how gravity moves at very low frequencies. They also create a new ruler for the universe, anchoring distance scales with an independent method tied to the rhythm of spinning neutron stars. The beauty here is redundancy. The more different rulers agree, the more confident the field becomes that the outward pressure and the scaffold of unseen mass are measured with trustworthy tools. He stops at a table where small glass cells glow. Inside, atoms are pumped by light to become exquisitely sensitive to magnetic fields. These magnetometers serve in searches for dark sectors that might couple to spins or induce oscillations in constants. They also police the experiments themselves, warning when environmental changes would mimic the signal being sought. Nothing is allowed to masquerade as novelty without passing through a screen of witnesses that record vibration, temperature, field, humidity, and time. She looks at a chalkboard covered in posteriors, curves that represent belief after evidence is weighed. The shapes are narrower than they were a decade ago. Where once there were broad plains of possibility, there are now valleys with walls steep enough to guide theory and experiment towards specific crossings. Forecasts are drawn for upcoming surveys, showing how much each probe will contribute, how combinations will break degeneracies, how blinding strategies will be improved, how calibration stars will be chosen, how clocks will be tied together with better phase. The plan is not a single project. It is a weave of many threads designed to highlight any place where a gentle deviation from simplicity might appear. He returns to the mezzanine and lets the view settle. Every instrument here is a listener. None shout at the sky. They attend to whispers and build trust slowly. The laboratories learn to make quieter rooms. The telescopes learn to correct for their own imperfections. The pipelines learn to carry uncertainty with care. The surveys learn to overlap and agree. The clocks learn to share time. The arrays learn to act as one. The habit of this listening is a promise that if the character of the unseen differs even slightly from the quiet picture, the difference will be found. It will be found not by ambition but by patience, not by an isolated triumph but by an orchestra of soft instruments holding a note until its true pitch is known. He sits in a room lined with whiteboards where numbers sleep in narrow columns. The day's work is not a revelation but a rehearsal. Parameters are fitted again with slightly different priors, models are swapped with careful hands, and maps are rotated to chase illusions into corners where they can be named and dismissed. The rhythm is unhurried. Cross-correlations are the refrain. One catalogue of shapes speaks with a catalogue of distances. A lattice of galaxy positions converses with a field of shears. A chart of velocities nods toward a chart of lensing. When two lines hum the same note, confidence grows. When they differ by a small step, Attention focuses like a lens on the interval between them. She observes how null results are framed with respect. A search for a rare recoil yields only background, and the team writes the result with clarity that feels like honesty taken to ceremony. No signal is itself a map, an outline around a territory where the unseen does not live. A survey returns no departure from the steady outward push, and the absence becomes a benchmark that future departures must surpass. The art of these trials lies in teaching the mind to love constraints. A corridor, narrowed by evidence, is a path, not a prison. It points the feet where they should go next. He revisits anomalies that once stirred conversation, a subtle tilt in a spectrum, a feature in a correlation function, a seasonal wave in a histogram. Each is treated with care and distance. Fresh data are collected without weight, added by hope. Independent pipelines process the same shots of sky, and blind factors hide the final normalization until every choice can be justified by tests that do not touch the coveted answer. Often the feature fades, revealed as an echo of a calibration star that aged or a software routine that left a fingerprint in the margin. Sometimes it endures, and then it is traced across different instruments until it earns the right to stay on the board. She looks at a table where degeneracies are listed like weather patterns that repeat in different seasons. Growth amplitude can mimic changes in distance. Galaxy bias can imitate a small slip in gravity. Intrinsic alignments can masquerade as lensing shear. To untangle them, experiments are designed to measure more than one thing at a time. Photometry is paired with spectroscopy. Shapes are paired with velocities. Temperatures are paired with polarizations. The pairings are chosen so that each nuisance leaves a different signature across the set. When the fit closes only with sensible values for all parts, the degeneracy is understood rather than merely contained. He turns to the ethics of repetition. Results are relearned by teams that did not take the original data. Public releases include not only maps but masks, weights, noise models, and full description of cuts. Code is archived with version control and containers that preserve environments so that a student across an ocean can press a key and reproduce a figure. The culture of these trials is plain. A claim must survive a second set of hands. Each survival adds polish to confidence until the surface becomes smooth enough for the next step. She contemplates the aging of instruments like the aging of living things. Sensors grow tired, coatings haze, alignment drifts by the width of a hair. The trial here is one of patience. Drift is modeled as a slow function rather than treated as a surprise. Calibration lamps are replaced on schedules that respect their moods. Baselines are remeasured in seasons when the air is most stable. Noise is recorded as a time series rather than as a single number. The result is a stack of small corrections that, taken together, keep the apparatus honest even as years pass. He studies pipelines as if they were rivers that must be kept clear of eddies. Every stage that touches the data leaves a trace. Bad pixels are masked. Cosmic rays are clipped. Photons are counted in apertures that slide to match seeing. Classifiers are tuned to avoid bias toward bright, round objects that masquerade as galaxies. Inference models carry uncertainty forward rather than replacing it with a point. The river reaches a bay where parameters are fitted, and the bay keeps the memory of the river's twists. In this way, the final numbers know where they came from. She examines how collaboration turns conflict quiet. Teams with different traditions meet at workshops, where the only loud sound is the espresso machine. One group trusts flexible fits. Another prefers strict models drawn from first principles. In the end, both are used. If they disagree, the disagreement is a tool. It reveals sensitivity to assumptions that must be tested with synthetic skies and mock halos. Minds that might once have argued now share a notebook, listing what would break each approach and then designing small experiments to try exactly those breaks. The atmosphere resembles a rehearsal for a concert, where the score allows interpretation without losing its theme. He notes that blind spots shrink when different measurements are combined in triangles rather than pairs. Geometry of distance, growth of clustering, and bending of light form three sides. If two agree and the third refuses, the attention tightens onto the stubborn side until either a subtle systematic is found or a small deviation is admitted with humility. These closure tests are repeated at multiple redshifts. so that a hiccup in one epoch does not pretend to be a law of nature. The quiet triumphs come when all three sides close within a fraction of their uncertainties, a moment of symmetry that feels like a deep breath taken and released without trouble. She listens to the steady beat of Bayesian updates. Earlier beliefs are not overwritten but adjusted. Priors learned from ancient light are combined with new likelihoods drawn from weak lensing and redshift space distortions. The posteriors narrow. The mean drifts slightly, often by less than the width of a finger on a plot. The movement may feel small, but it carries weight. A tenth of a standard deviation, repeated across a web of related parameters, tightens the room in which invention can pace. Theories that once relaxed on sofas now sit upright. Some excuses grow thin. Some ideas gain grace by needing fewer exceptions. He reflects on paradoxes that remain politely unsolved. Small structures resenting a universal script. A rate of expansion calibrated by nearby ladders that walks a step faster than the tune set by the infant sky. These are not alarms. They are motifs that recur. The trials continue by changing the key in which they are played. New standard candles are studied. Distances are anchored with time delays and with ripples caught in pulsar timing. Growth is remeasured with fresh tracers, and the arrival of waves is compared again with flashes from the same events. Piece by piece, the motif either fades as a harmony is found, or it sharpens into a new line that asks for a different harmony altogether. She considers the humility of deliberately simple models. When two explanations fit, the quieter one is preferred. Additional parameters are allowed only when the data pay for them, with a clear gain in evidence. Overfitting is treated like a lullaby that makes children sleepy but leaves them unprepared for morning. Underfitting is treated like a mattress that is too firm to rest upon. Between these lies an even support that is kind to the back. The discipline teaches that elegance is not ornament. It is the minimum that sustains the weight of what is known. He thinks of how the community pays attention to signals that repeat across instruments built by strangers. A small departure measured by one camera invites a check by another on a different mountain. A drift in a background spectrum raises a question that radio telescopes can address in another band. A timing feature in a high-energy flash invites optical and infrared ears to listen for an echo. Each repetition in a different tongue removes the accent, leaving only meaning. In this gradual harmonization, the field moves without haste toward a consensus that is strong precisely because it has taken its time. She watches as line items in proposals become parts of a symphony. An upgrade to optical coatings promises fewer ghosts. A change to detector readout reduces crosstalk that could mimic a shear signal. A new survey cadence improves the sampling of supernova light curves so that distance estimates are less sensitive to unmodeled evolution. These details may seem small, but the trials live in such margins. When enough margins are straight, the page reads clean. The result is a clarity that allows the mind to rest, not because questions are finished, but because the way questions are handled is sound. He steps outside into the evening and looks up with the ease of someone who has learned to trust the method as much as the result. The ongoing trials are not a contest. They are a schooling of curiosity by discipline. Cross-correlations knit independent truths into a fabric that does not tear easily. Null results remove costumes that once distracted. Paradoxes resist, but their resistance sharpens tools. With each season, the space of the possible becomes smaller in a way that feels generous instead of confining. What remains is a picture that continues to hold, and a set of edges where new light might enter. In that balance between firmness and openness, sleep finds a place to settle. He sits by a window that frames a quiet slice of sky and considers what it would mean if the unseen were finally named. A new particle would be more than a discovery. It would be a doorway cut into the wall of what counts as matter. The catalogue of quarks and leptons would expand from a tidy family portrait into a larger household with cousins who kept to themselves. Forces would gain a new dialect, spoken in a sector that barely acknowledges the glow of stars. If a wave-like field were confirmed, the idea of matter would soften into something closer to music, with mass arriving from the comb of oscillations rather than from particles alone. In both cases, a boundary would move, and with it a sense of completeness that once felt within reach. She turns the thought toward the infancy of everything. When the first moments are modelled, details disappear behind equations that only hint at their actors. A confirmed dark particle or field would give those equations a face. Its properties would set the temperature at which it fell out of step with the ordinary plasma and decide how quickly tiny ripples grew into the bones of the web. The earliest structures would gain a clock and a tone, altering which seeds survived and which dissolved. That clock would also revise the limits on possible theories of inflation, the story that writes the initial perturbations which later grew into galaxies. Each revision would push speculation out of fog and into work that resembles craft. He imagines a halo not as an abstraction but as a place where physics has a specific texture. If the unseen carries its own interactions, cluster cores would be laboratories that weigh those interactions directly through shape and density. Variations in cross-section with velocity would become measurements rather than guesses. Central regions of dwarfs would become diagnostics rather than puzzles. Streams around galaxies would be read like seismograms, written by a medium whose viscosity is finally known. The entire field of galactic dynamics would shift from inferring properties to testing them, and the change in posture would feel like stepping from a shoreline into shallow warm water where the body remembers how to float. She considers how the quiet pressure that eases separations would reshape the meaning of future. If the pressure is truly constant, horizons appear in a practical sense, regions that forever recede beyond communication. Physics inside each horizon evolves toward monotony. The stars burn down, the gas thins, the night withdraws all distant lights except those bound by gravity nearby. Acceptance of that fate tests the ability to find comfort in long arcs rather than in plot twists. If the pressure drifts softly with time, another ending is possible. A weakening would hand the stage back to gravity, allowing new gatherings at grand scales long after the present. A strengthening would hasten isolation, then risk a tearing of the bonds that now hold systems together. In all cases, the future remains quiet, but the quiet takes different shapes. He thinks of clocks and how a better understanding of the dark sector would refine every instrument that seeks precision. If a field couples to constants even slightly, long baselines of timing could sense seasonal breaths or galactic tides through shifts that repeat with location and epoch. Those shifts might one day be used in navigation that listens for space itself to murmur. The first step would be to subtract the murmur in order to purify measurements of expansion and growth. The later step would be to use it as a signature, a map of gentle variations in the field's strength that lends a new kind of cartography to the sky. She returns to particle colliders and imagines a small excess in a clean channel that repeats across runs. A missing energy spectrum develops a shoulder in perfect sympathy with a model that had stayed modest in journals for years. The shoulder is traced to a mediator that opens a narrow portal between visible and dark families. Such a bridge, once measured, would allow a kind of engineering at scales far removed from daily life. No one would expect machines that harness dark radiation in any practical sense. The significance would be conceptual. Nature would be larger than the glowing part, and technology would have touched its border. He turns to philosophy softly, not as an escape from measurement, but as a translation of it. If most of the cosmos is made of quiet things that rarely speak, then existence is built on patience. Gravity is the only conversation partner they accept, and gravity is the slowest language. This patience nurtures tapestries that require 1 billion years to reveal their pattern. A species that seeks meaning in quick flashes would be invited to learn another pace. The invitation would come not as a sermon but as a fact, written in halos and in the spacing of clusters, in the geometry of distances and the relief of the web. To accept the lesson would be to find rest in narratives that unfold at a scale beyond a single life, yet carry comfort into a single night. She touches the idea of unification with a hand that has learned to avoid haste. If the dark particle shares a symmetry with known fields, a new group would hold both under one umbrella. If it turns out to be entirely apart, a compartment would be added rather than merged. Both outcomes shape expectations. A shared symmetry would motivate new spectra of particles, new decays, and new limits on rare processes. A separate compartment would ask for portals, tiny couplings that explain how two worlds exchange a few coins of influence. Either way, the search would gain guidance. Theory would stop throwing pebbles in every direction and instead lay stones on a path that leads to instruments designed with purpose sharpened by evidence. He allows himself a glance at meaning for creatures who listen to the night as a way to sleep. Perhaps the greatest gift of naming the unseen would be a shift in how safety is imagined. The galaxy is stable not because the bright alone balances itself, but because an invisible scaffold holds it. The future is spacious not because nothing cares, but because a gentle pressure shares in the work. The architectures that carry worlds and widen distances have chosen quiet over spectacle. That choice, once recognized, can ease minds that fear that only violence drives history. The true drivers are often low notes, continuous and unthreatening. She frames consequences for the earliest light. If a dark field existed then, it would have tugged on the ripples frozen into the background glow. Those tugs would appear as subtle changes in heights and spacings of harmonics. Reanalyzing that map with a confirmed influence would refine the portrait of infancy and tell whether other quiet sectors hid behind the one now identified. The background would become a palimpsest, where multiple notes can be read separately once one is understood. This is not a deepening of mystery for its own sake. It is a sharpening of edges, so that the remaining mysteries can take clearer shapes. He thinks of adaptation in models of galaxy formation. Today, subgrid recipes handle star formation and feedback, standing in for processes too fine to simulate directly. With a known dark interaction or mass scale, those recipes would include new terms. Turbulence would be stirred or damped differently. Accretion histories would bend by a small degree. Disks would find new equilibriums. Outskirts would gain or lose satellites according to a law that can be measured on the bench. The messy middle between cosmology and astrophysics would become cleaner by a margin that matters. Predictions would stop being accommodations and start being consequences. She listens for whispers in gravitational waves. If gravity's speed and dispersion are already disciplined by observation, what remains is the effect of the dark sector on backgrounds of waves from many sources. The influence would be tiny, a change in how noise adds up over years. Still, the understanding that it is there would let analysts subtract it, then fold the residuals into deeper searches for primordial waves. Outcomes would cascade. Limits on inflation would tighten. The relation between fields would harden from hypothesis into constraint. Constraint would fertilize invention in the right places, rather than everywhere at once. He wonders how explanations alter fear. Heat death, by one description, is a thinning of stories until only cold remains. Another description is more forgiving. Entropy grows by making room. The smooth pressure that encourages space to open is part of that hospitality. With it, regions drift apart before they can disturb each other. Within each region, bound systems keep their quiet dramas for longer. If the pressure is a constant, then hospitality lasts indefinitely. If a field, it lasts long enough for meaning to be made without hurry. Knowing which case applies will not change a morning, but it can soften a night. She ends where comfort often begins, with balance. The dark sector is not an intrusion, it is a partner to light. If particle, it holds weight without crowding. If wave, it carries strength without shouting. If pressure, it makes room without pushing. Theories that fold it into a whole without strain will inherit the calm that the universe already shows in its large-scale portrait. Observers who learn to listen for small departures will continue to form a bridge between what can be seen and what can be felt. On that bridge, interpretations will settle like snow, quiet and bright, until a step forward becomes possible without breaking the surface. He settles into a chair by an open window, where night air moves like a slow tide through the room. The sky carries a patient glitter, each star a quiet syllable in a sentence that needs no hurry. He lets the breath fall into rhythm with that patience. In the rhythm, a story unfolds that asks nothing more than attention. Weight without light holds the lamps of the heavens in their places, and a pressure without hands gives the stage its widening. The combination is not a contradiction, it is a partnership. One gathers, one grants space, and between the two a canvas appears where spirals can turn, clusters can convene, and small worlds can cool enough for minds to listen. She thinks of how a galaxy finds its poise. A disk is an argument resolved by gravity and time. gas circles, friction softens edges, stars collect into lanes that remember the compromises of their birth. Around the disk, a halo with no glow steadies the speed of far-flung orbits, like a steady hand on the outer rim of a spinning plate. The hand is never seen. Its effect is felt in a curve that stays level when it might have fallen. That steadiness becomes a kind of kindness. It prevents the fragile from flying apart. It allows the long game of chemistry and cooling and quiet repetition that leads to structure finer than any single burst could carve. He imagines distance as a fabric that does not resist a gentle stretch. Where the weave would have wrinkled under its own pull, an even pressure relaxes the tension. The relaxation is slow, so slow that the mind can rest in it without sensing motion. Yet with time a change gathers. Horizons form as simple consequences of a geometry that prefers grace over crowding. The nearest company remains, bound by mutual regard. The rest drifts into silence that does not accuse or abandon. It simply makes room. He finds a calm in that room, like the space between notes that gives a melody its ease. She listens for a lesson written in that architecture. The bright is a surface, important and beautiful, but it rests on a depth that hardly ever speaks. The depth carries most of the load. To accept this truth is to loosen a grip on spectacle. It is to become interested in continuity, in the way a low note can hold an orchestra together, in the way a constant can hold a universe to a path that allows peace. In the mind that learns this interest, anxiety gives way to trust. History need not be a chain of explosions. It can be a slow cadence that grants time for small things to become subtle. He considers the way smallness serves as a mirror for largeness. A heart keeps time inside a ribbed shell, and a galaxy keeps time inside a halo that remembers long collisions as gently as tree rings remember weather. Breath flows out and in, and expansion breathes space wider while gravity gathers within the breathing. A body that goes to sleep is not defeated. It is reorganizing its attention. The sky at scale does something similar. The web relaxes into a clarity that was always implied by its first conditions, yet it needs ages to declare itself. In that delay, there is mercy. Frenzy would never allow such refinement. She imagines a traveler pausing on a ridge where two filaments cross. The view is not dramatic, but it is complete. One road trails toward a cluster where gas glows and tides are strong. Another leads toward a void where loneliness is soft and forgiving. The traveler feels the pull of both and understands that no single path is right for every time. The universe offers a variety of rooms. Some are good for forging, others for ripening, others for rest. Even without knowing the names of these places, anyone can sense their tone. The tone invites sleep, not as escape, but as a flexible attention that can meet the day when it returns. He remembers that light bends around mass in a way that allows the unseen to be sketched, as surely as if it were painted. A lens need not be polished to transparency. Gravity makes every concentration a lens regardless of its composition. Arcs and smears in deep photographs are the handwriting of this fact. They tell the truth without calling attention to themselves. To trust them is to accept that reality often speaks through influence rather than display. It is a lesson that translates well into rooms where no telescope stands. Influence is usually quiet. The important currents are not noisy. She thinks of the pressure again, the smooth kind that never breaks into waves. Its character is unlike wind or water. It does not shove. It persuades the whole of space to relax in a single direction, outward. The persuasion happens at once, everywhere, with the same softness. To imagine such a thing is to practice a gentler will, one that changes the shape of a day not by striking it, but by giving it room. The pressure requires no borders or barrages. It is the polite insistence that there is enough space for everything to breathe. He looks at the night as if it were a lake caught between a full moon and a breeze. Ripples carry the memory of old emotions, but the surface remains composed. Stars are reflections that sink while he watches, not because they fade, but because the earth turns the mirror. Turning is the common law. Every turning is stabilized by masses that do not glitter and supported by distances that expand at a pace that asks for patience. Somewhere in that arrangement, a person can fall asleep without losing the thread. The thread is long, and it will be waiting in the morning. She allows herself a last inventory of comforts. There is more matter than meets the eye, and that excess is the reason structures hold their shape. There is more energy than meets the senses, and that surplus is the reason distance does not choke on its own gravity. The two facts do not clash. They co-author a world that is both gathered and spacious. The parts that catch the eye are few and wonderful and temporary. The parts that carry the whole are many and modest and lasting. To favour the lasting is a choice aligned with rest. He imagines how a single candle, placed in a room with windows that look on darkness, can feel brighter for being small. The candle does not claim the room, it accepts it. The darkness is not a threat. It is the background that makes the flame legible, the partner that lets heat map itself onto air. The unseen mass, the quiet pressure, and the soft physics that bind and widen are all versions of that background. Without them, flame would be frantic or extinguished. With them, flame can be a story told at an easy pace. She closes her eyes and knows that the best lullabies never force sleep. They offer a rhythm that makes sleep welcome. In the same way, the largest structures and the deepest influences do not demand belief or fear. They offer a rhythm that the heart can learn. Their rhythm is rotation made safe by halos, distance made kind by smooth pressure, and growth made elegant by tides that remember their own restraint. To tune to that rhythm is to find a posture in which the body lets go and the mind keeps a gentle watch that feels like mercy. He listens to the small sounds of the room, the chair answering tiny shifts, the branch outside, signifying the slow air, the distant hum of a city fading under midnight. None of these sounds disturb the larger quiet. They live inside it like stanzas inside a poem. The poem is a truth about weight and stretch and time, and he does not need to recite it to know it. It is enough to be carried by it. In that acceptance, sleep becomes the next lawful step, as lawful as a star curving in its orbit, as lawful as a filament feeding a cluster, as lawful as space relaxing at its tender pace. She takes a breath that falls slightly deeper than the last, and then rises with a lighter effort. The breath is small, yet it mirrors the great swell of the whole. Between the two scales there is kinship. The kinship does not require grandeur to be felt. It requires only the willingness to be quiet where quiet is already present, to trust the work of the unseen where the unseen has already proven itself, to let the lights on the ceiling stand for lanterns at the ends of filaments, to let the pillow stand for a void where nothing jostles. With these gentle substitutions, the mind learns an ease that the sky has known for a long time. He opens his hands and lets them rest. The room darkens by a fraction as the eyes drift half-closed. Stars return to their long work beyond the roofline. The unseen returns to its care without complaint, and the pressure resumes a widening that needs no witness. The world is not asking for an answer. It is offering a place to rest. In that place, the smallest sleeper becomes a collaborator in the largest symmetry. The collaboration requires no effort, only trust. He gives it, she gives it, and the night receives it as a natural thing. A window leans into the sky, and the sky leans back, the two surfaces touching without a seam. On one side, breath finds its cadence. On the other, distances find theirs. There is a kinship in the timing. Hearts slow as spiral arms turn, not because the arms demand it, but because the rhythm they keep is generous. The body recognizes generosity without being told. It answers by releasing the day. Darkness gathers into shapes that eyes will never name, and those shapes are the reason lamps do not wander. A softness pervades the fabric of space, and that softness is the reason rooms do not shrink. These are not alarms, they are assurances. Every orbit is held by a patience older than stars. Every horizon is drawn by a calm that prefers kindness to crowding. To rest inside such assurances is to join a continuity that was always waiting. Let the thoughts pass like faint satellites, bright for a moment, then gone. Let the pillow take the role of a quiet valley between ridges of breath. Let the ceiling become a low cloud that carries no rain. What needs keeping will be kept by the same gravity that keeps worlds. What needs letting go will drift on the same tide that carries galaxies apart with care. Sleeplessness listens for a reason. Here is one. The universe prefers peace wherever it can manage it. It builds scaffolds that do not glitter and writes forces that do not shout, so that brightness can have a stage and time can have a gentle slope. Accept that preference, and the lids grow heavy. Accept it, and the shoulders loosen. Accept it, and the room becomes a harbour. Close the eyes. Keep the rhythm. The rest is handled. End of script. Sweet dreams.